At 70 years old, I was still working hard doing handyman jobs to make ends meet while my adult children lived rent-free in my house. I never complained. After all, they were my family. But when my own daughter looked me in the eye and casually said, "Dad, your truck is an absolute embarrassment," something inside me finally snapped. I had worked my entire life, and for her to sneer at the very vehicle I relied on to put a roof over her head was the ultimate betrayal. I knew I had to make a change right then and there, but my entitled children had no idea just how drastic that change would be. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Ellis Freeman, and this is the story of how I taught my children the true cost of their arrogance. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of summer day that was already suffocatingly hot by 10 o'clock. I was lying flat on my back against the concrete driveway, sliding under the chassis of my 2005 Ford F-15. Oh, my hands were coated in a thick, stubborn layer of black grease and motor oil. I was just tightening the last bolt on the oil pan, getting ready to head over to a neighbor's house to fix a busted plumbing line. That was my routine. To the outside world, and more importantly to my own children, I was just a tired old handyman scraping by on a meager pension and odd jobs. The driveway I was lying in belonged to a beautiful 6-bedroom house in a very upscale, quiet neighborhood. A house that I owned free and clear but allowed my daughter Camille and her husband Wyatt to live in without paying a single dime in rent. Suddenly the sharp, rhythmic clicking of expensive high heels echoed across the pavement, cutting through the peaceful morning air. I slid out from under the truck, wiping my forehead with the back of my forearm. Standing there was my daughter Camille, wearing a tailored designer pantsuit that cost more than most people make in a month. Beside her stood Wyatt, my son-in-law. Wyatt was a 35-year-old tech startup founder who loved to wear expensive blazers paired with pristine white sneakers. He looked down at me, his nose literally crinkling in disgust, as if the smell of honest hard work somehow offended his delicate sensibilities. He took a deliberate step back, making absolutely sure his expensive shoes did not come anywhere near the small puddle of oil on the concrete. "Ellis," Wyatt said, his voice dripping with that quiet, polite condescension he always used with me, "you are going to have to move this junk heap. Today." I slowly got to my feet, grabbing an old rag from the bumper to wipe the grease off my fingers. I looked at him, then at Camille. "Move it where?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "Anywhere but here," Dad, Camille chimed in, crossing her arms defensively. "Wyatt is hosting a major pitch meeting this afternoon in the living room. He has 3 major angel investors coming over. They are flying in from Silicon Valley, and they are used to a certain standard. We cannot have this rusted-out monstrosity sitting in the driveway. It is a complete embarrassment." Wyatt sighed dramatically, adjusting his expensive watch. "Look, Ellis," he continued, intentionally emphasizing my first name instead of calling me Dad or Mr. Freeman. "These men are top-tier venture capitalists, very wealthy, very traditional in their expectations of what a successful founder looks like. If they pull up to my residence and see a dirty old handyman truck leaking oil on the pavers, it ruins the entire aesthetic. It makes me look desperate. It makes the neighborhood look cheap. Just take it to the public lot a few blocks away and walk back. And please do not wander around the main floor wearing those greasy coveralls while they are here. It sends the wrong message." The sheer audacity of his words hung heavily in the hot air. My own son-in-law, a white man whose failing business was secretly subsidized by the fact that he lived in my house for free, was telling me to hide myself and my truck so he could pretend to be a self-made millionaire. The racial and class undertones were impossible to miss. He wanted the affluent lifestyle but did not want his wealthy investors to see the working-class black man whose property he was using to build his fake empire. I looked at Camille, hoping my own flesh and blood would defend me. Instead, she just looked away, silently agreeing with her husband's humiliating demands. I did not yell. I did not throw the oily rag in his face. Over my decades in the construction business, I had learned that the most lethal weapon a man can wield is complete and utter silence. I simply nodded. I threw the rag into the bed of the truck, opened the creaky door, and climbed into the driver's seat. The old engine roared to life, a sturdy, reliable sound that contrasted sharply with the fragile egos of the 2 people standing in my rearview mirror. As I drove down the manicured streets of the neighborhood, memories flooded my mind. They thought I was a broken-down old man with nothing to his name. They did not know that 15 years ago I had sold the commercial construction empire I built from scratch. I had bought that 6-bedroom house with cold, hard cash. I had established the Apex Trust, a financial fortress that held over $18 million. I chose to live simply continuing to do handyman work because it kept me grounded and allowed me to quietly donate the money I earned to local charities. I had kept my wealth a secret because I wanted my children to learn the value of hard work to build their own legacies, just like my late wife Nadine and I had done. But clearly that lesson had failed spectacularly. Instead of parking a few blocks away as instructed, I merged onto the highway and drove straight into the financial district downtown. I parked my battered, grease-stained truck right between two luxury sedans in front of the central bank. I walked through the heavy glass doors, still wearing my dirty coveralls. The security guard eyed me suspiciously, his hand resting on his belt, but my financial lawyer and trust manager, Mr. Bradley, practically tripped over his own feet, rushing out of his glass office to greet me. "Mr. Freeman," he said, his voice trembling with deference and respect. "It is an absolute honor to see you. Please come right into my office." I sat down in the plush leather chair across from his polished mahogany desk. Mr. Bradley nervously offered me a water, which I politely declined. I leaned forward, resting my rough, calloused hands on his pristine desk. "I need to open the Apex Trust files immediately," I told him, "and I need a full, detailed audit of every secondary account attached to my name." He scrambled to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with panicked efficiency. Within moments, the screens displayed a dizzying array of numbers. My $18 million sat safely in various diversified portfolios. But as we scrolled down to the supplementary credit accounts, the ones I kept open with strict limits just for absolute emergencies to help my children, my blood ran cold. "Mr. Freeman," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "Are you aware of this recent transaction? A secondary card under the name of your son Kendall was just charged $12,000. $12,000, I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "For what?" Mr. Bradley pulled up the merchant details, swallowing hard. "It appears to be an exclusive ski resort and luxury chalet rental in Aspen, Colorado. The charge was authorized by Kendall and his wife Chelsea just 3 hours ago." I stared at the glowing screen, the betrayal washing over me in cold waves. My lazy son and his entitled white wife were funding a lavish winter getaway on my dime, stealing from me while claiming they could barely afford groceries. Meanwhile, my daughter and her arrogant husband were actively trying to hide my existence in my own home. I had spent years being the silent provider, the patient father, the invisible safety net. But the time for silent generosity was officially over. It was time to close the bank. Mr. Bradley sat completely still behind his massive mahogany desk. A bead of sweat formed at his temple as the glowing monitor reflected his panicked expression. $18 million sat quietly in the Apex Trust, a sum that demanded absolute respect in the financial world. Yet the secondary accounts showed a brazen, pathetic theft of $12,000. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in the leather chair and looked Mr. Bradley dead in the eye. "Cancel it," I instructed with a voice as cold as forged steel. "Cancel the Aspen transaction immediately, then freeze every single secondary credit card attached to my name. Shut down the auto pay for Chelsea's retail boutique lease. Cancel the automatic transfers for Wyatt's vehicle financing. Lock them all out entirely." Mr. Bradley swallowed hard. His fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the keyboard. "Mr. Freeman, are you absolutely sure?" he asked cautiously. "The bank will flag these as fraudulent charges. The abrupt halt on the commercial lease and the auto loans will trigger immediate default protocols. Collections will act within 24 hours. "I am fully aware of how a default protocol works, Mr. Bradley," I replied. "Execute the order. Do not notify them under any circumstances. Let the automated system handle the rest." He nodded rapidly and hit the final key. The financial lifeline was officially severed. I drove my battered Ford back to the house, parking it exactly where Wyatt had demanded I hide it earlier. I walked through the side door into the massive kitchen of my own home, still wearing my grease-stained coveralls. Sitting at the marble island were my son Kendall and his wife Chelsea. Chelsea was a 30-year-old woman who treated my home like her personal luxury resort. She was surrounded by sleek shopping bags from high-end winter sporting brands, pulling out a pair of designer ski goggles with manicured fingers. Kendall was mindlessly scrolling through his phone, not even bothering to look up, when the man who provided his roof walked into the room. "Well, look who decided to show up," Chelsea said. Her tone dripped with that familiar, stinging condescension. She held up a pristine white cashmere sweater, checking the price tag with a satisfied grin. "We are getting ready for Aspen. It is a desperately needed getaway. Running a boutique is just so exhausting, you know." I poured myself a glass of tap water, keeping my expression perfectly blank. "I am sure it takes a heavy toll," I replied evenly. Kendall finally glanced up, giving me a dismissive once-over. "You smell like motor oil, Dad. Could you maybe change in the garage next time? It is ruining the appetite." Chelsea laughed. It was a sharp, irritating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Let him be Kendall. Someone has to do the dirty work. In fact, Ellis, you might want to pick up a few extra plumbing jobs this weekend. We are going to need someone to look after the house while we are mingling with the elite in Colorado." The audacity of her statement was almost impressive. She was standing in a house I paid for packing for a vacation she bought with my stolen money, and advising me to clean more toilets to keep myself busy. I took a slow sip of my water. "Aspen is beautiful this time of year," I said calmly. "I hope you packed warmly. I hear the financial climate can change very abruptly." Chelsea smirked, completely missing the warning in my words. "Oh, we will be perfectly fine. We only stay at 5-star chalets. The heating is impeccable." I nodded, rinsing my glass in the sink. "Have a wonderful trip," I told them, turning to walk down the hallway to my private study. I left them to their delusions of grandeur, knowing full well that their luxury chalet reservation was currently bouncing through the bank fraud department. Once inside my study, I locked the heavy oak door and sat down at my desk. I pulled out my tablet and opened the encrypted application that connected to the security cameras I had installed months ago for property insurance purposes. The screen flickered to life, showing the living room in crystal clear, high definition. Wyatt had returned from his precious pitch meeting and was now celebrating with Camille, Kendall, and Chelsea. They were passing around a bottle of vintage Bordeaux that I had purchased a decade ago, laughing loudly and clinking expensive crystal glasses. Watching them toast to their fabricated success, my chest tightened with a heavy, painful memory. I thought of Nadine, my beautiful, hardworking wife. I remembered the nights she stayed up until 2 a.m, rubbing her aching back after long shifts at the accounting firm. She worked herself to the bone to pay off Kendall's early college debts he had racked up while partying instead of studying. I remembered how she drained her personal savings to bail Wyatt out of his first disastrous business venture because Camille had cried and begged us for help. Nadine gave them everything. She gave them her time, her health, and her heart. She believed that our sacrifices would build a foundation of gratitude and respect. Instead, our generosity had bred a generation of leeches who viewed our hard work as their inherent right. Looking at the screen, seeing them drink my wine in my house while mocking my existence, I felt the last shred of paternal leniency evaporate entirely. Nadine was gone, and I was done protecting them from the real world. The era of free rides was over. The next morning arrived with a crisp, cool breeze. I was sitting on the back patio drinking a simple cup of black coffee, enjoying the profound quiet of a house that was about to become an absolute war zone. Suddenly, the tranquil silence was shattered by a harsh, grinding mechanical noise coming from the front yard. The unmistakable hiss of heavy air brakes echoed loudly through the affluent neighborhood. I set my coffee mug down on the patio table and walked calmly through the house toward the front window. A massive, heavy-duty tow truck with flashing yellow and red lights was backing aggressively into my pristine driveway. It completely bypassed my hidden Ford F-150 and angled directly toward Wyatt's prized possession, a sleek midnight black Porsche Panamera. A burly man in a high-visibility safety vest stepped out of the truck cab. He held a thick metal clipboard in one hand and a set of heavy steel chains in the other. He did not hesitate or look around for permission. He walked straight to the rear axle of the luxury sports car and dropped the heavy chains to the concrete pavement with a loud, ringing clash. The metallic clatter of the heavy steel chains hitting the concrete driveway was a beautiful symphony to my ears. The burly tow truck driver did not waste a single second. He swiftly kicked the thick metal hooks under the rear bumper of the pristine midnight black Porsche Panamera, securing them to the chassis with practiced, unforgiving precision. The hydraulic winch began to whine a high-pitched mechanical squeal that signaled the abrupt end of an era. Suddenly, the heavy oak front door of my house flew open so forcefully it slammed violently against the brick exterior. Wyatt charged out into the morning air. He was completely frantic, wearing nothing but a silk monogrammed bathrobe and bare feet. "Wait, stop what you are doing right now!" he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He sprinted down the driveway, waving his arms wildly as if he were trying to flag down a rescue helicopter. "Get your dirty hands off my vehicle. Do you have any idea who I am?" The tow truck driver did not even blink. He calmly hit a lever on his control panel and the rear wheels of the luxury sports car lifted effortlessly off the ground. Wyatt rushed right up to the driver, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "This is a massive mistake," he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at the man's chest. "My accounts are perfectly fine. My tech startup just secured major funding last quarter. The bank system must be glitching. You need to put my car down immediately before I sue you and your entire company into bankruptcy." The driver pulled a folded yellow document from his clipboard and shoved it directly toward Wyatt's chest. "Take it up with the recovery department, buddy," the driver said in a flat, unbothered tone. 3 missed payments. The repossession order was finalized at midnight. I just do the hooking. Wyatt snatched the paper, his eyes darting frantically across the printed text. He looked completely unhinged, the polished, arrogant startup founder facade shattering into a million pathetic pieces right there on my driveway. Camille rushed out of the house next, pulling a cardigan tightly around her shoulders. She took one look at the Porsche suspended in the air and gasped. "Wyatt, what is happening?" she cried out. Wyatt ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining it completely. "It is a clerical error, Camille. The bank froze my primary autopay account by mistake. The driver says he will not unhook the car unless I pay the outstanding balance and the recovery fee in cash right now." Camille spun around, her eyes frantically searching the driveway until they landed on me. I was standing near the garage doors, calmly holding a pair of gardening shears. She marched straight toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the pavement. "Dad," she demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "Go to your safe and get $5,000 right now. Wyatt needs to pay this man before the neighbors see this absolute disaster. Do it quickly." I looked at my daughter. The sheer entitlement radiating from her posture was breathtaking. She did not ask nicely. She ordered me. She expected me to instantly produce thousands of dollars to cover her husband's failure, all while standing in the driveway of the house they lived in for absolutely free. I slowly shook my head, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "I cannot do that, Camille," I said quietly. Her eyes narrowed into angry slits. "What do you mean you cannot do that? You always have emergency cash stashed away for rainy days." "Go get it. We will pay you back when the bank fixes this ridiculous error." I let out a dry, raspy chuckle. "Camille, I am just a handyman," I replied, echoing the exact insulting sentiment they had thrown in my face just the day before. Where on earth would I get $5,000 in cash? I fix leaky pipes and patch drywall for a living. You and Wyatt are the successful ones in this family. Surely an elite tech founder has a few $1,000s lying around for a minor emergency. Camille stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She was completely paralyzed by my refusal. Wyatt jogged over his silk robe, flapping in the breeze, completely abandoning his superior attitude. "Ellis, please!" He begged, the condescension entirely gone from his voice, replaced by raw, humiliating desperation. "I need that car. My angel investors are expecting me to drive to a lunch meeting at the country club tomorrow afternoon. I cannot show up in a standard rideshare. It ruins my entire image." I looked down at his bare feet on the concrete, then up to his panicked, bloodshot eyes. "Maybe you can borrow my truck," I suggested smoothly. "It runs perfectly fine and it is fully paid off." Wyatt turned pale suddenly, realizing that the old black man he had so casually insulted 24 hours ago was currently his only lifeline, and that lifeline had just been permanently severed. The loud commotion had not gone unnoticed. Across the street, Mrs. Higgins had stopped watering her petunias and was openly staring at the scene unfolding. 2 doors down, Mr. Vance paused his morning jog, pulling out his smartphone to blatantly record the spectacle. Wyatt noticed the audience and visibly shrank into himself. The arrogant, untouchable startup CEO was standing barefoot in the street, watching his ultimate status symbol get hauled away by a blue-collar worker he would usually ignore. The tow truck engine roared to life, drowning out Wyatt's final pathetic protests, and the pristine Porsche was pulled out of the neighborhood, disappearing down the affluent street. Camille covered her face with her hands and ran back inside the house, completely humiliated. Wyatt stood frozen on the concrete for a long moment before silently following her, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. I turned around, walked to the shed, picked up my lawnmower, and calmly pulled the starter cord. The engine sputtered to life, emitting a steady, honest hum. As I pushed the mower across the thick green grass, I mentally analyzed my son-in-law's pathetic financial reality. Wyatt's entire existence was a carefully constructed house of cards. His startup had not generated a single dollar of actual profit in over 2 years. He survived solely on business loans, credit extensions, and the grand illusion of success. By instructing Mr. Bradley to freeze my secondary accounts, I had simply pulled the bottom card out from under him. Without my silent, ongoing funding, he could not even afford the monthly lease on the car he used to project his fake wealth. He was completely broke, and the walls were closing in fast. I knew the crushing desperation would soon drive him to make a foolish mistake, but I severely underestimated just how quickly that mistake would happen and who else would be involved. That afternoon, I decided to leave the property and visit a local hardware store, intentionally giving them some space to panic in private. I wanted the pressure to cook them slowly. However, I did not stay away completely blind. I parked my Ford F-150 a few miles down the road in a diner parking lot and pulled out my tablet to monitor the hidden interior security cameras. The house remained quiet for about an hour, but then the front door chimed open. Chelsea, my son Kendall's wife, walked into the grand foyer. She was not alone. Strutting in right behind her was a slick, sharp-suited white man carrying a laser measuring tool and a thick leather portfolio. I recognized him instantly from the luxury real estate billboards scattered around town. He was one of the most aggressive property brokers in the city. Chelsea pointed enthusiastically toward my vaulted ceilings and swept her hand across my custom hardwood floors. The broker nodded greedily, activating his laser tool to calculate the square footage of my grand living room. I zoomed in on the camera feed, watching my entitled daughter-in-law casually guide a stranger through my 6-bedroom home. I turned up the audio feed just in time to hear Chelsea's sickeningly sweet voice echo through my hallway. "Do not worry about the old furniture or the outdated decor," she told the broker with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "The owner is an elderly man and he is relocating very soon. We want to list the property by the end of the month. We are looking for a fast cash sale to fund a new business venture." My blood turned to ice, followed immediately by a burning, righteous fury. They were not just stealing my money to fund their lavish vacations. They were actively conspiring to sell the very roof over my head. I did not wait another second. I threw my heavy work truck into gear and sped back down the affluent neighborhood streets toward my property. I slammed the heavy oak front door open, startling the slick, suited white broker who was currently pointing his digital laser measure at my custom stone fireplace. Chelsea gasped, her hand flying to her chest in exaggerated shock. "Ellis, what are you doing here?" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the foyer. "You are supposed to be at the hardware store fetching supplies." I ignored her completely. I marched straight up to the broker, snatched the expensive laser tool right out of his hand and tossed it carelessly onto the sofa. "I am the sole owner of this property," I stated, my voice dangerously low and completely unyielding. "You have exactly 10 seconds to pack up your leather portfolio and get off my estate before I call the police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing." The broker turned incredibly pale, sensing the absolute finality and quiet danger in my tone. He did not say a single word in his defense. He grabbed his tool, snatched his leather bag, and practically ran out the front door without looking back. Chelsea stood frozen in the middle of the grand living room, her jaw dropped in pure shock. Before Chelsea could recover her composure and mount a defense, Kendall strolled into the room from the kitchen, casually holding a half-eaten apple. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the furious expression on my face and the broker's luxury sedan speeding away through the front window. "What is going on here?" Kendall asked, chewing loudly and looking utterly unbothered by the tension in the room. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised to be a strong, respectable black man, now standing comfortably in a house he did not pay a single dime for, while his wife actively tried to sell it out from under me. "Your entitled wife just brought a real estate agent into my home to appraise it for a fast cash sale," I said, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. Chelsea immediately crossed her arms, dropping her shocked act and adopting a highly defensive stance. "Oh, please, Ellis, do not be so dramatic about this," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "We are simply exploring our financial options. You are 70 years old. You do not need a massive 6-bedroom mansion all to yourself." Kendall stepped forward, actually nodding in agreement with his delusional wife. "She is right, Dad. Be reasonable for a second. This house is going to be ours eventually anyway. We are just accelerating the timeline a bit. Wyatt is facing a major cash flow issue with his tech startup, and we all had a family meeting and agreed that liquidating this asset is the most logical step to save the business. It is a given. You can move into a nice, quiet retirement apartment in a cheaper area. We will even help you pack your things." I stared at them, absorbing the sheer, unfiltered arrogance of their words. They had completely convinced themselves that my hard-earned property was their personal piggy bank. They were actively planning to render me homeless to bail out Wyatt's failing tech illusion. You all agreed, I repeated, keeping my tone perfectly level. You sat around my dining table eating food I bought and decided to sell my house to fund a fake business. Kendall sighed heavily. Dad, do not be stubborn. You are completely out of touch with how modern finance works. Wyatt's company is the future. We are making an executive decision for the good of the family portfolio. You are not making an executive decision about anything, I replied, stepping closer to him, forcing him to step back. You do not own a single brick of this estate. You do not own the grass in the yard or the shingles on the roof. This is my house, bought and paid for by my sweat and your mother's sacrifices, and as of this exact moment, your free ride is permanently canceled. Kendall frowned, finally sensing the massive shift in the atmosphere. What are you talking about? I looked directly at Chelsea, then back to my son. I am giving you a formal verbal eviction notice, I stated clearly. You have exactly 30 days to pack your designer bags and get out of my property. All of you. Kendall, Chelsea, Camille, and Wyatt. You are entirely on your own. The color drained completely from Kendall's face, replacing his lazy arrogance with absolute terror. Chelsea stumbled backward, her haughty smirk vanishing into thin air as the reality of my words struck her. You cannot do that! She shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, grating whine. We have nowhere else to go. You cannot just throw your own flesh and blood out onto the street. I did not stay to entertain their pathetic panic. I turned my back on them, walked straight down the hallway to the master suite, and shut the heavy oak door firmly behind me. The lock clicked loudly, finalizing the physical barrier between my peaceful sanctuary and their chaotic, toxic entitlement. I walked over to my mahogany desk and picked up my phone. I dialed Mr. Bradley's direct line, not wasting a single second to secure my legacy. Mr. Freeman, the lawyer, answered promptly, his tone respectful. How can I assist you this afternoon? Mr. Bradley, I need you to draft a formal legal document immediately, I instructed, my voice unwavering. I am officially cutting Kendall, Camille, and their respective spouses completely out of my will. I want a comprehensive disinheritance clause drawn up today. Revoke any and all future claims to the Apex Trust, the real estate portfolio, and every single one of my personal assets. Mr. Bradley paused for only a fraction of a second, likely surprised by the severity of the request, before responding with utmost professionalism. Understood, sir. I will prepare the documents for your signature right away. They will receive absolutely nothing from the estate. I thanked him and ended the call. The swiftness of the action brought a profound sense of relief to my chest. I had finally severed the parasitic cord that had drained me for years. I sat in the quiet comfort of my room, opened my encrypted tablet, and pulled up the security camera application again. The feed switched to the kitchen area. Camille and Wyatt had returned from their bedroom, drawn out by Chelsea's loud, hysterical sobbing. The four of them were huddled around the marble island, looking like cornered, desperate animals. Wyatt was pacing back and forth, his face flushed with manic desperation. The repo man taking his Porsche had severely wounded his pride, but my sudden eviction notice threatened to destroy his entire fraudulent existence. We cannot just leave, Camille cried, burying her face in her trembling hands. We have absolutely no money. The credit cards are declining everywhere. Wyatt stopped pacing and slammed his hands down hard on the countertop. His eyes were wide, filled with a dark, predatory calculation that chilled my blood. We are not leaving, Wyatt, hissed his voice, dropping to a sinister whisper that the high-definition microphone picked up perfectly. The old man is clearly losing his mind. No sane father kicks his children out onto the street to protect an empty, echoing house. We do not need his permission to sell it. We will get a psychiatric certificate. We will have him declared legally incompetent and place him in a care facility. Once we have medical power of attorney, he will lose all control of the estate, and the house is ours to liquidate. The very next evening, the stifling tension in my house inexplicably vanished, replaced by the rich, savory aroma of roasted lamb and garlic herbs. I walked into the formal dining room and found the long mahogany table set with our best china. Camille was wearing a floral apron over her designer clothes, pouring red wine with a bright, entirely fabricated smile. Dad, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. We want to apologize for how things escalated yesterday. We know we overstepped and we just want to have a peaceful family dinner. Wyatt stood near the wine rack, looking overly relaxed in a crisp button-down shirt. He gestured to a white man in his late 50s sitting at the head of the table. The man wore a tweed jacket and had sharp, calculating eyes that immediately began scanning my posture and demeanor. "Ellis," Wyatt said smoothly. "This is a dear colleague of mine, Dr. Vance. He was in town for a conference, and we thought it would be wonderful for him to join us." I looked at the man, recognizing the predatory glint in his eyes. The trap was set. We took our seats around the table. The clinking of silverware against expensive china felt like a ticking clock. Dr. Vance did not waste any time with polite small talk. Almost immediately, his conversational tone shifted into a thinly veiled clinical interrogation. "So, Ellis, doctor." Vance began leaning forward and steepling his fingers. "Wyatt tells me you built this magnificent home yourself. That must have been quite a while ago. Do you happen to recall the exact year you broke ground?" I kept my face perfectly slack, staring blankly at my plate for a few seconds longer than necessary. "Well," I mumbled, scratching my chin slowly, "I suppose it was back in the late 90s, or maybe early 2000s. The years tend to run together when you work as much as I did." Wyatt exchanged a quick, triumphant glance with Camille. Dr. Vance nodded sympathetically, jotting something down in his mind. "It is perfectly normal for timelines to become hazy at your stage of life, Ellis," he said in a soothing, patronizing tone. "Managing such a massive estate must be incredibly overwhelming for you now. Do you ever find yourself feeling confused by your daily tasks or struggling to handle your finances?" I let my shoulders slump, playing the role of the defeated, senile old man they so desperately wanted me to be. "Oh, the numbers are just a headache these days." I sighed heavily. "Sometimes I cannot even remember where I put my own truck keys. In fact, I was just asking Cheryl about them this morning." Across the table, Chelsea stiffened her face, turning bright red at being called the wrong name. "My name is Chelsea," she snapped instinctively. Kendall nudged her sharply under the table to keep her quiet. "Oh, my apologies, sweetheart," I said, giving her a vacant, bewildered smile. "You girls change your hair so much it is hard for an old man to keep track." Dr. Vance leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a gentle, probing whisper. "Ellis, have you experienced any sudden outbursts of anger or paranoia recently? Sometimes when our cognitive functions decline, we can lash out at the people who care about us the most. We might even make irrational decisions like asking our beloved family members to leave their home." I looked at Wyatt, who was practically vibrating with anticipation. He was feeding this corrupt doctor the exact narrative needed to declare me incompetent. They wanted a medical professional to document my supposed mental decline so they could strip away my rights and seize the Apex Trust. I simply nodded slowly, staring into my wine glass. "I suppose I have been a bit grumpy lately," I whispered, letting my voice crack just a fraction. "It is just so hard to keep up." Dr. Vance offered a reassuring smile. "That is exactly why we are having this chat, Ellis. You are surrounded by people who want to shoulder these heavy burdens for you. You do not have to worry about managing properties or finances anymore. You just need to rest." I took a slow bite of the roasted lamb, chewing methodically. "Yes," I replied quietly. "Resting sounds very nice." Wyatt grinned, a victorious, greedy smirk spreading across his face. Beneath the heavy oak dining table, resting quietly on my lap, was my smartphone. The screen was dark, but the voice recording application had been running since the moment I walked into the room. I was capturing every leading question, every manipulative suggestion, and every fabricated diagnosis pouring out of Dr. Vance. As I listened to his smooth, educated voice trying to strip away my autonomy, a cold wave of memory washed over me. 20 years ago, Nadine and I had sat at a very similar table across from a slick, fast-talking insurance agent. Nadine had been recovering from a grueling surgery, exhausted and heavily medicated. The agent had used that exact same soothing, patronizing tone. He buried her in complex legal jargon, twisting her words and manipulating her into signing a document that nearly voided her critical health coverage. I remembered the sheer terror and helplessness in my wife's eyes when she realized she had been tricked by a man in a nice suit. I swore to her that day that I would never again allow an educated predator to use their credentials to steal from my family. Sitting here now, watching Wyatt use a corrupt psychiatrist to try and steal the very house Nadine and I had built, that old promise hardened into an unbreakable resolve. I was not a helpless patient, and I was certainly not losing my mind. I was a man meticulously gathering federal evidence. I shifted my finger slightly, ensuring the microphone was perfectly positioned to catch Wyatt eagerly agreeing with the doctor's fake assessment. The agonizing dinner finally concluded. Dr. Vance wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, stood up, and gave Wyatt a very subtle, confirming nod. I excused myself, playing the part of the exhausted elder, and shuffled slowly down the hallway toward my private study. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, my frail posture vanished entirely. I stood tall, locked the deadbolt, and immediately pulled up the security camera application on my tablet. The feed switched to the outdoor patio. Wyatt was standing by the pool, pressing his phone tightly to his ear. He was practically bouncing on his heels. "We got it," Wyatt hissed into the receiver, speaking to his own attorney. "Vance is writing up the preliminary medical evaluation tonight. He says the old man is completely gone, textbook dementia with paranoid delusions. File the petition for conservatorship and medical power of attorney first thing tomorrow morning. I want full control of his assets by the end of the week." Wyatt laughed, a cruel, triumphant sound echoing into the night sky. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He had no idea that I had just hit send on my smartphone. The unedited, crystal-clear audio file of the entire dinner, fully exposing the fraudulent medical evaluation and their malicious conspiracy, landed directly in the secure email inbox of Mr. Bradley. Early the next morning, before the sun had even fully crested the horizon, Mr. Bradley executed the first phase of my counterattack with ruthless precision. I did not need to be in Dr. Vance's upscale downtown clinic to know exactly how the scene played out. At precisely 8 o'clock, a bonded legal courier walked through the clinic doors and handed the receptionist a thick, red-sealed envelope marked urgent and confidential. Inside was a formal cease and desist order from one of the most powerful financial law firms in the state. The document was accompanied by a direct transcript of the audio I had recorded the night before. Mr. Bradley did not just threaten a civil lawsuit. He promised total professional annihilation. The letter explicitly stated that if Dr. Vance submitted any psychiatric evaluation regarding my mental competence, the unedited audio file proving his collusion in a fraudulent medical diagnosis would be immediately forwarded to the state medical board and the district attorney. It was a guaranteed revocation of his medical license and a one-way ticket to federal prison for medical fraud. The arrogant doctor who had so smoothly tried to steal my autonomy over roasted lamb was instantly reduced to a terrified coward. Back at my house, I was quietly pruning the rose bushes near the side windows of Wyatt's home office. I had a perfect view through the sheer curtains. Wyatt was sitting behind his sleek modern desk, sipping a green smoothie, radiating unearned confidence. He was already drafting emails to his investors, projecting the illusion of a man who had just secured his financial future. His smartphone buzzed on the glass desktop. I watched him snatch it up, a triumphant smirk plastering his face. He answered the call, expecting the final confirmation that my life was officially in his hands. Instead, the color drained from his face at a terrifying speed. Even through the double-paned glass, I could hear the panicked, high-pitched squawking of Dr. Vance on the other end of the line. The corrupt doctor was hysterical. He told Wyatt that the deal was completely off, that a team of ruthless corporate lawyers had somehow acquired a recording of their entire conversation, and that he was destroying all his notes regarding my evaluation. Wyatt stood up his chair, scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "Wait, Vance, do not hang up." Wyatt shouted, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. Who sent the letter? How could anyone have a recording? But the line was already dead. Dr. Vance had blocked his number and severed all ties to the conspiracy. Wyatt stared at his phone in absolute disbelief. The reality of his situation crashed down on him like a concrete wall. Without my medical power of attorney, he had no access to the Apex Trust. Without the trust, he could not liquidate my estate. And without the estate, he was completely and utterly ruined. The smirk was gone. The polished tech CEO facade melted away, revealing the panicked, desperate fraud underneath. He hurled his smartphone across the room. It smashed into the drywall, shattering the screen instantly. He grabbed his expensive green smoothie and threw it against the custom bookshelves, leaving a thick dripping stain over his collection of unread business biographies. Wyatt paced the room like a caged animal, grabbing his hair and hyperventilating. He kicked a leather armchair, sending it crashing into a side table. A framed photograph of him and Camille fell to the floor, the glass splintering into jagged pieces. He collapsed onto his knees amidst the wreckage of his own office, burying his face in his hands. The crushing weight of his monumental debts was finally suffocating him. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, the fabricated lifestyle were all financed by money he did not actually have. He had built his entire identity on a mountain of high-interest business loans, and the lenders were rapidly closing in. I stood in the garden meticulously trimming a dead branch from a rose bush, feeling a profound sense of calm. I was not shocked by his violent outburst. I was merely watching the inevitable consequences of his own boundless greed. Through my ongoing consultations with Mr. Bradley, I knew the exact mathematical reality of Wyatt's desperation. His highly publicized tech startup, which he endlessly bragged about to anyone who would listen, was a complete financial disaster. He was burning through capital at an astonishing rate, funding his extravagant lifestyle instead of developing actual software. According to the discreet financial audit Mr. Bradley had run, Wyatt was currently $2 million in the red. He needed a minimum injection of $2 million by the end of the month just to satisfy his primary creditors, make payroll for his skeletal staff, and avoid forced corporate bankruptcy. $2 million. It was a sum he could not possibly raise on his own, especially with his credit cards currently declining at local grocery stores, thanks to my total financial freeze. Watching him sob on the floor of his office, surrounded by broken glass and spilled green juice, I felt no pity. He had looked at a 70-year-old black man who had worked his entire life and saw nothing but a target to be exploited. He had actively tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my home. His suffering was entirely self-inflicted, and the pressure was pushing him exactly where I wanted him to go. He was out of legal options, which meant he would soon resort to illegal ones. By late afternoon, the desperation had fully consumed him. I told Camille I was going to the hardware store to pick up some heavy-duty pipe sealant, making sure they both knew the house would be empty for at least an hour. I drove away, but immediately pulled over 3 blocks down and opened my encrypted tablet. The security feed from my master bedroom blinked onto the screen. I watched as my bedroom door slowly creaked open. Wyatt slipped inside, glancing nervously over his shoulder. He moved with the frantic, jerky motions of a cornered thief. He bypassed my dresser and went straight for the walk-in closet, heading directly to the heavy steel floor safe tucked in the back corner. I had anticipated this exact maneuver. I had intentionally changed the combination the day prior to something a desperate, arrogant man would easily guess. Nadine's birth year. Wyatt punched the 4 digits into the keypad with trembling fingers. The green light flashed. The heavy steel door clicked open. He dropped to his knees, frantically digging through the organized folders. He bypassed the old photographs and the sentimental trinkets, his greedy hands searching for the real prize. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and opened it. Inside was my original Social Security card and the physical, unencumbered deed to the 6-bedroom house. Wyatt clutched the documents to his chest, his eyes wide with a manic, dangerous relief. He had no idea he had just stepped directly into a federal trap. I sat in the cab of my old Ford F-150, the vinyl seat warm against my back, waiting in the parking lot of the hardware store. The engine idled quietly, providing a steady, comforting rumble. Suddenly, my smartphone vibrated sharply in the cup holder. It was not a text message from a neighbor or an email from a supplier. It was an encrypted, high-priority alert from my advanced credit monitoring service. The screen flashed red, indicating a hard inquiry had just been made against my Social Security number. I tapped the notification, watching the detailed report unfold in real time. Someone was actively initiating a massive commercial mortgage application, attempting to leverage the deed of my 6-bedroom estate as primary collateral. The requested amount was exactly $2 million. The applicant listed on the preliminary digital paperwork was Wyatt, but the guarantor signature processing through the system was a forged digital copy of my own name. He had taken the documents from my safe and immediately driven to a predatory lending firm desperate enough to commit identity theft right out in the open. I stared at the screen, a cold, hard smile forming on my face. A normal man would have immediately dialed emergency services. A normal father would have rushed home, kicked down the door, and demanded the stolen documents back while threatening police involvement. But I was not a normal man, and I was far past the point of simple parental discipline. If I stopped him now, Wyatt could easily spin the narrative. He would hire a sleazy defense attorney and claim it was a mere misunderstanding, a desperate attempt by a son-in-law trying to manage the family portfolio. He might get a slap on the wrist, a misdemeanor charge, or a suspended sentence. That was completely unacceptable. I wanted him destroyed legally and financially beyond any hope of recovery. I picked up my phone and dialed Mr. Bradley's direct line. The lawyer answered on the second ring. "Mr. Freeman, is everything all right?" he asked, his tone immediately shifting into high alert. "Mr. Bradley," I said, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "My son-in-law has just initiated a $2 million commercial loan using my stolen Social Security number and the deed to my primary residence. He is forging my signature as we speak. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Sir, I will contact the authorities and the fraud department of that lending institution immediately. We can halt the transaction before any documents are legally bound. Mr. Bradley stated, the sound of his keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. No, I commanded, my voice cutting through his panic like a blade. Do absolutely nothing to stop the approval process. Let the bank approve that $2 million loan. Mr. Bradley stopped typing. The silence on the line was thick with absolute confusion. Mr. Freeman, with all due respect, that is highly dangerous. If that loan is approved and he secures the funds, he is putting a massive lien on your property. You could be held liable for millions. I let out a low, dry chuckle. Mr. Bradley, you and I both know that commercial lending across state lines, utilizing digital signatures and electronic fund transfers, elevates this from a simple local theft to a severe federal crime. It becomes wire fraud. It becomes aggravated identity theft. I want him to sign his name on those federal documents. I want the approval to go through the system. Once he legally binds himself to a fraudulent $2 million federal transaction, he is not looking at local probation. He is looking at a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Just ensure our legal team is monitoring the wire transfers so the money never actually moves. Let him hang himself. I could practically hear the lawyer smiling on the other end of the connection. Understood, Mr. Freeman. It is a brilliant, albeit ruthless strategy. We will monitor the underwriting process. We will allow the approval to clear the initial stages so the criminal liability is permanently locked in. I ended the call and put my truck into gear. The trap was set and the bait was incredibly sweet. By the time I returned home and parked my truck in the driveway, the atmosphere inside the house had completely transformed. The suffocating panic that had gripped Wyatt for the past 48 hours was entirely gone. I walked through the kitchen door and found him standing by the marble island, popping the cork on a $200 bottle of champagne. Camille was clapping her hands, her designer rings sparkling under the pendant lights. He had received the preliminary approval email from the predatory lending firm. In his delusional, arrogant mind, he was a certified genius who had just outsmarted the system and secured his failing company's future. Ah, Ellis Wyatt said, his chest puffed out, the condescending smirk firmly back on his face. He did not offer me a glass. It looks like the universe rewards true visionaries after all. My startup just secured a massive bridge loan. We are fully funded for the next development phase. I am ordering a new sports car tomorrow morning to replace the one your bank glitch temporarily inconvenienced. Camille leaned against his shoulder, giving me a pitying look. See, Dad, she said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. You worried over absolutely nothing. Wyatt knows exactly what he is doing. He is a master of finance. You can go back to fixing toilets and let the real businessmen handle the big numbers. I simply nodded, walking past them to grab a bottle of water from the fridge. I watched Wyatt pull out his phone and immediately begin booking a lavish celebration dinner at the most expensive steakhouse in the city. He was spending imaginary money, completely blind to the federal noose tightening around his neck. However, the arrogant celebration was drastically short-lived. 2 days later, while I was fixing a loose hinge on the front porch, I heard Wyatt screaming obscenities inside his home office. The lending firm had indeed approved the fraudulent $2 million commercial loan, firmly locking in his federal crime. But there was a massive, insurmountable catch written deep into the underwriting terms. Mr. Bradley had utilized his vast banking connections to ensure a specific compliance hold was placed on the disbursement. Wyatt could not access a single dime of the $2 million until he provided proof of matching capital from a verified institutional investor. The bank required a lead venture capital firm to validate the startup's worth before they released the wire transfer. He was trapped in a financial purgatory, holding an approved loan he could not touch. Through my hidden cameras, I watched him frantically scouring the internet, his eyes bloodshot, desperately searching for any major investment fund willing to back his fake tech company. He needed a whale, and he needed it fast. His manic typing suddenly stopped. He stared at his monitor, a wide, desperate grin spreading across his face. He had found a massive anonymous private equity fund known for making aggressive investments in local startups. He printed the contact page, completely unaware that the billionaire entity he was about to solicit for his salvation was the Apex Trust. He was officially hunting my own company. Wyatt spent the next 12 hours locked inside his home office, frantically crafting the perfect pitch to the Apex Trust. Through my hidden cameras, I watched him sweat through his expensive dress shirt, drinking cup after cup of espresso as he polished his fabricated financial projections. He hit send just before midnight, collapsing back into his leather chair in a state of utter exhaustion. He had no idea he had just sent his fraudulent business model directly to the desk of my personal attorney. The very next afternoon, I sat in the cab of my truck and gave Mr. Bradley the green light. "Send the bait," I instructed. Exactly 10 minutes later, Wyatt let out a scream that practically shook the windows of my house. He bolted out of his office, sprinting down the hallway like a madman. He had just received an official email from a senior representative of the Apex Trust. The message was incredibly concise and highly professional. The fund was extremely impressed with his startup's potential and was officially offering a primary venture capital injection of $5 million. The impossible hurdle of the bank's matching capital requirement had just been miraculously cleared. Wyatt thought he had just won the ultimate lottery. The sheer volume of their celebration could be heard all the way from the street. By the time I walked through the front door later that evening, the grand foyer was littered with empty champagne bottles and discarded takeout containers from a luxury sushi restaurant. Wyatt had gathered Camille, Kendall, and Chelsea in the massive living room. The music was blaring, and the four of them were jumping around like they had just conquered the entire financial world. "We are rich!" Camille shrieked, throwing her arms around Wyatt's neck in pure ecstasy. $5 million. We are finally going to leave this dump and buy our own private estate. I stood quietly in the archway, wiping my heavy work boots on the welcome mat. Wyatt caught sight of me and immediately turned the music down, his face flushed with overwhelming arrogance and cheap champagne. "Ellis," he slurred slightly, holding up his crystal glass. "You are looking at the next major player in Silicon Valley. Apex Trust is backing us. They are sending a senior partner down here this weekend to sign the final paperwork and authorize the wire transfer. My company is about to be valued at over $50 million. I maintained a perfectly blank expression, hiding the lethal calculation behind my eyes. "That sounds like a very important meeting," I said smoothly. "Congratulations on your sudden success." Wyatt set his glass down on the marble coffee table, his arrogant smirk turning into a hard, serious scowl. "It is an incredibly important meeting," he stated, stepping closer to me. "The senior partner of a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund is coming to this exact house. And that brings me to a very serious issue, Ellis." Camille walked up and stood beside her husband, crossing her arms firmly. "Dad," she said, using that sharp, impatient tone she always reserved for me, "we need the house to be absolutely immaculate this weekend. No offense, but you walking around in dirty boots and smelling like pipe sealant is not the vibe we need to project. This is a massive corporate event." Wyatt nodded in agreement, pointing a condescending finger at my chest. "Exactly. We are hosting a high-stakes signing party. There will be catered food, expensive drinks, and top-tier corporate lawyers. I cannot have you wandering through the background looking like the hired help. It is extremely embarrassing. We need you to make yourself scarce. In fact, it would be best if you just left the property for the entire weekend. Go stay at a cheap motel. Go fishing. Just do not be here when the Apex executives arrive. These wealthy white venture capitalists are not going to hand over $5 million if they think I conduct business in a house shared with a blue-collar handyman." His words were a masterclass in raw, unfiltered disrespect. He was standing in a house I owned, asking me to vacate my own property so he could impress an investment firm that I actually controlled. He was perfectly willing to erase my existence just to secure his fabricated wealth. I did not raise my voice, nor did I display a single ounce of the burning fury raging inside my chest. I simply offered them a soft, accommodating smile. "You make a very fair point, Wyatt," I replied in a quiet, defeated tone. "I would not want to ruin such a prestigious occasion for you. I have been meaning to take my old boat out to the lake anyway. I will pack my gear and go fishing for the weekend. The house will be entirely yours." Camille let out a massive sigh of relief, completely blind to the trap closing around her. "Thank you, Dad. We really appreciate you understanding how critical this is for our future." I nodded and walked straight to my private study. I locked the heavy door, sat down at my desk, and immediately dialed Mr. Bradley. The lawyer answered instantly. "Mr. Freeman, the bait was taken," he said, a distinct hint of satisfaction in his professional voice. "Mr. Bradley," I said coldly, "I need you to draft the final investment contract for the $5 million injection." However, I want ironclad trap clauses embedded deeply into the paperwork. I want Wyatt to sign a personal guarantee making him directly liable for every single fraudulent financial projection he submitted in his pitch. I want his signature to legally bind him to the federal wire fraud scheme without any possibility of a corporate shield. When he signs that document, I want his fate completely sealed. Mr. Bradley agreed without hesitation, promising the contract would be a lethal legal weapon that no defense attorney could ever dismantle. Out in the living room, the chaotic celebration continued to rage on. But while Wyatt and Camille were busy planning their grand signing event, my hidden cameras picked up a very different conversation happening between Kendall and Chelsea in the kitchen. Chelsea was aggressively scrolling through high-end designer websites on her phone, her face twisted in a bitter, envious pout. "We cannot show up to a $5 million signing party wearing last season's clothes, Kendall," she hissed, slamming her phone onto the granite counter. "Wyatt and Camille are going to look like royalty, and we are going to look like their poor, pathetic relatives. I need a new dress, and you need a custom-tailored suit." Kendall groaned, rubbing his temples in utter frustration. "Chelsea, my credit cards are still completely frozen. Dad locked us out of everything. I do not have a single dollar to my name right now." Chelsea leaned in close, her eyes narrowing with malicious, greedy intent. She glanced toward the hallway leading to my master suite. "Wyatt found the deed and the social security card in your dad's safe just a few days ago," she whispered wickedly. "If the old man left the combination the same, there has to be more in there. Cash, jewelry, valuables. We just need a little advance on our inheritance to look the part." Kendall hesitated for only a second before a greedy, sickening smile spread across his face. They were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. 3 days before the highly anticipated corporate signing party, I decided to check the trap I had deliberately left open. I walked into my master bedroom, the quiet hum of the central air conditioning masking the sound of my heavy footsteps. I went straight to the walk-in closet and knelt before the heavy steel floor safe. The digital keypad still displayed the faint smudges of Kendall's frantic fingerprints. I punched in the combination and pulled the heavy steel door open. I did not care about the loose cash I kept for emergencies, nor did I care about the decoy property documents Wyatt had already stolen. My eyes darted immediately to the back of the bottom shelf. The polished mahogany box, a beautifully crafted humidor that I used as a jewelry case, was sitting slightly ajar. I reached out and flipped the lid open completely. The dark velvet cushion inside was completely empty. The vintage solid gold Rolex Submariner, the exact watch Nadine had bought for me to celebrate our 20th wedding anniversary, was gone. It was my most prized possession, a symbol of our enduring love. My own son had crossed the final, unforgivable line. I did not march into the living room and demand answers. I did not scream or confront Kendall and Chelsea, who were undoubtedly out right now spending the stolen funds on overpriced designer outfits to impress people they did not even know. Anger is a useless emotion when you are building an airtight federal case. Instead, I calmly closed the safe door, stood up, and grabbed my truck keys. I knew exactly where a lazy, desperate man like Kendall would go to liquidate a high-value luxury item quickly. I drove straight to the largest, most established pawn and jewelry exchange in the downtown district, a place known for handling high-end collateral, without asking too many inconvenient questions. I walked through the heavily fortified glass doors, the little entry bell chiming above my head. The owner, a shrewd older white man named Victor, was inspecting a diamond ring behind the reinforced display counter. I approached the counter, my face entirely devoid of emotion. Victor looked up, taking in my faded coveralls and scuffed work boots, likely assuming I was there to pawn some old power tools for quick cash. "Can I help you, buddy?" Victor asked, his tone polite but incredibly dismissive. I placed both of my hands flat on the glass counter. "Yesterday afternoon, a black man in his early 30s came in here," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "He was wearing designer clothes and acting highly erratic. He sold you a solid gold vintage Rolex Submariner with a custom engraving on the back casing that reads, 'To Ellis, forever building together. Love, Nadine.'" Victor froze instantly. His professional, arrogant demeanor slipped and a flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes. He instantly realized he had just purchased a stolen, highly traceable luxury watch. "Look, I run a legitimate business here," Victor stammered, taking a quick step back from the counter. "We check government identification for every single transaction over $500. I assure you everything was done entirely by the book." I pulled my driver license out of my wallet and slid it across the glass. The engraving bears my name. The watch belongs to me. It was stolen from my personal safe yesterday. Now we can handle this quietly, or I can have my legal team and the local police department shut your entire operation down pending a grand theft investigation. Victor swallowed hard, staring at my identification. He quickly tapped his computer keyboard, bringing up the recent transaction logs. He turned the monitor slightly so I could see the glowing screen. The man who brought it in showed a valid state identification. The name on the file is Kendall Freeman. He told me it was an early inheritance gift from his father. Victor let out a heavy sigh, running a nervous hand over his face. He accepted $8,000 in cash for it. $8,000 for a pristine timepiece easily valued at over $30,000 on the vintage market. Kendall was not only a thief, but an incredibly foolish one. He had sold a priceless family heirloom for pennies on the dollar just to buy a bespoke suit and a cocktail dress for a fake corporate party. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavily restricted secondary debit card, the one linked directly to my primary operating account that my greedy children knew absolutely nothing about. I will buy it back right now for the exact $8,000 you gave him, plus a $2,000 convenience fee for your trouble, I told Victor without blinking. However, I require the original transaction receipt bearing my son's signature, and I need a digital copy of your security camera footage from yesterday afternoon showing him physically completing the fraudulent transaction at this exact counter. Victor did not hesitate for a single second. He swiped my card, processed the transaction, and retreated rapidly to his back office. 10 minutes later, he returned with a sealed white envelope containing the printed receipt and a small flash drive. He also handed me the mahogany box containing my gold Rolex. I opened the box, verifying the familiar heavy weight and running my thumb over the engraved words from my late wife. As I secured the watch around my wrist, I felt a profound, chilling shift deep within my chest. Whatever lingering, irrational hope I had held on to regarding my son completely evaporated into thin air. The final drop of paternal affection, the instinct to protect my own blood, was officially erased. Kendall was no longer my son. He was just another common criminal who had made the fatal mistake of stealing from the wrong man. I walked out of the pawn shop and got back into my old truck. The heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing me inside the quiet, isolated cab. I did not start the engine right away. I pulled out my encrypted smartphone and bypassed Mr. Bradley altogether. I dialed a direct, secure line that my lawyer had established for me just a few days prior. The phone rang only twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. "Special Agent Carter," the voice said crisply. "Agent Carter, this is Ellis Freeman," I replied, staring blankly through the windshield at the bustling city street. "I have the security footage and the signed transaction receipt proving grand theft of a luxury asset by Kendall Freeman. This is in addition to the fraudulent $2 million commercial mortgage application currently processing under Wyatt's name across state lines." Agent Carter let out a slow, steady breath. "That is the final piece of the puzzle, Mr. Freeman. We have wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and grand larceny all fully documented. You have handed us an airtight federal prosecution." I started my truck, the engine roaring to life with a fierce, vindicating power that shook the chassis. "Good," I stated coldly. "The fabricated signing party is scheduled for this Saturday night at the Grand Plaza Hotel. I want your team in position. Prepare the arrest warrants. We are taking them all down." Early Thursday morning, a mobile notary pulled into my driveway. Wyatt answered the door wearing a crisp, bespoke suit purchased with the money Kendall had stolen from my safe. He ushered the notary into the formal dining room, completely unaware that the very chandelier above his head concealed a high-definition camera. I stood in the kitchen, wiping down the marble countertops with a damp sponge playing the role of the invisible help. Wyatt confidently slid the $2 million commercial mortgage agreement across the table. The notary, a tired-looking woman who just wanted to get her stamp and leave, pointed to the guarantor line. Wyatt did not hesitate for a single second. He picked up his expensive fountain pen and forged my signature with practiced, terrifying ease. He handed the document back legally, sealing his own fate. The notary stamped the thick stack of papers, packed her leather bag, and walked out the front door. Wyatt let out a loud, triumphant whoop, aggressively pumping his fist in the air. He had just legally bound himself to a massive federal crime, and he was celebrating like he had won the lottery. I walked into the living room, a heavy cardboard box in my hands, silently packing away my personal books and framed photographs. Camille and Chelsea were sitting on the plush sofas sipping sparkling water and directing a team of event planners. The workers, mostly young black men and women, were carrying heavy floral arrangements and staging equipment for the upcoming pre-party photo shoot. Chelsea snapped her fingers aggressively at a young man carrying a massive centerpiece. "Put that over there and be careful," she barked, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "Do not scuff the hardwood floors. These are expensive, and I highly doubt your minimum wage paycheck can cover the damages." The young man tightened his jaw but remained silent, setting the flowers down exactly where she demanded. I felt a familiar protective anger rise in my chest, but I kept my face perfectly neutral. Camille turned her attention to me, eyeing my cardboard box with obvious relief. "Good. You are finally packing," she said, crossing her legs. "The catering team is arriving tomorrow to prep the kitchen for Saturday, and we really need you out of the way, Dad. We cannot have you bumping into the event staff in those dirty clothes. You are just going to confuse them." Wyatt strolled into the room holding his freshly stamped fraudulent mortgage documents. He looked at my box and smirked. "It is for the best, Ellis. You are going to love the lake. Just take your truck and enjoy the peace and quiet. We will handle the high-level corporate interactions here. You just focus on relaxing and staying out of sight." Kendall walked down the stairs wearing his brand-new tailored suit, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. He looked at me carrying the box out of my own home and did not show a single ounce of remorse. In fact, he looked proud of himself. "Have a good fishing trip, Dad," he said smoothly. "Make sure you pack enough bait." I picked up my box, looking at my daughter, my son, and the two arrogant spouses they had brought into my life. "I will be completely out of your hair by tomorrow morning," I assured them in a quiet, defeated tone. "I hope your big signing party is everything you deserve." Chelsea let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, it will be Ellis. We are ascending to a completely different tax bracket. The people attending this event at the Grand Plaza are the true elite of the city. You would not even know how to speak to them without embarrassing us." I nodded slowly, walking toward the front door. "Have a wonderful time ascending, Chelsea," I replied. I carried the heavy box out to the driveway and loaded it into the back of my Ford F-150. I was not packing to move out of my own home. I was packing the final physical copies of the financial ledgers, the pawn shop receipts, and the encrypted flash drives. The trap was fully loaded. I drove straight past the lake route and headed directly to the Federal Building downtown. I carried my cardboard box through the metal detectors and took the elevator up to the highly secure floor. Mr. Bradley and Special Agent Carter were waiting for me in a sterile, windowless conference room. I placed the box on the cold metal table. "Here is everything," I stated firmly. "The forged mortgage documents Wyatt just signed this morning have already been processed by the bank digital system. The pawn shop receipt for the stolen Rolex is in the red folder. The camera footage of Kendall committing grand theft is on the encrypted drive." Agent Carter opened the box, meticulously inspecting the contents. He looked up at me, his expression grave and deeply respectful. "Mr. Freeman, you have executed this flawlessly. We have coordinated with the local police department regarding your son and daughter-in-law. The federal warrants for your son-in-law are already signed by a federal judge." As we reviewed the final operational timeline, I remembered the grueling days I spent building my construction company. I remembered facing predatory banks that point-blank refused to loan capital to a black contractor, forcing Nadine and me to bootstrap every single project with our own blood and sweat. We built an empire through sheer integrity, undeniable skill, and a relentless grind. Now these entitled, lazy children were trying to steal that exact empire through cheap lies and blatant forgery. They believed their proximity to my wealth gave them the right to take it. Looking at the federal warrants resting on the table, I felt absolutely no remorse. Mr. Bradley closed his leather briefcase, snapping the heavy brass locks shut. "The Apex Trust representatives are scheduled to arrive at the Grand Plaza Hotel at exactly 8:00 on Saturday night," he said, smoothing his tailored suit jacket. "Wyatt is expecting a team of anonymous wealthy white investors to hand him a $5 million check to save his fake company. We will give him exactly the dramatic, highly public entrance he so desperately desires." Agent Carter nodded, sliding the thick stack of arrest warrants into his tactical jacket. "My undercover agents will be positioned at all the hotel exits," he confirmed. "We will quietly secure the entire perimeter before the VIPs arrive. Nobody is leaving that ballroom until I give the order." I thanked the men and walked out of the Federal Building, stepping into the bright, blinding sunlight of the bustling city. I climbed into my old battered truck and drove back toward my neighborhood, knowing this would be the last quiet night my so-called family would ever experience. The trap was fully primed, the bait was entirely swallowed, and the federal noose was officially tied tight. Saturday night was fast approaching, and the elite society Wyatt and Chelsea so desperately wanted to join was about to witness the most spectacular, devastating downfall in corporate history. I returned to my own driveway late Friday afternoon, parking my old Ford F-150 near the curb. The 6-bedroom estate I had built from the ground up was completely transformed into a chaotic staging ground for Wyatt's delusional success. Massive white rental tents were being erected on the back lawn, and fleets of luxury catering vans blocked the garage. I walked through the side entrance, keeping my head down, playing the role of the obedient, discarded old man. Inside, the sheer volume of their arrogance was suffocating. Wyatt was strutting through the grand foyer, barking orders into his brand new smartphone, presumably purchased on credit he still did not have. He was confirming the guest list for Saturday night, casually dropping the names of local politicians and minor celebrities he intended to impress. Camille and Chelsea were standing in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by towering floral centerpieces and stacked crystal glassware, acting as if they were royalty holding court. They were completely intoxicated by the illusion of their impending $5 million windfall, blissfully unaware that the federal government was already printing their arrest warrants. The air in the house was thick with expensive perfume and unearned superiority. I walked toward the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water, intentionally keeping my grease-stained coveralls visible, eager to see how far they would push their newfound fabricated power. Chelsea spotted me immediately and wrinkled her nose in extreme disgust. "Ellis, I thought you were supposed to be completely packed and gone by now." She snapped her manicured fingers, aggressively pointing toward the back door. "The elite catering staff is arriving in exactly 20 minutes for the final walkthrough. We cannot have you lingering around looking like you just crawled out of a sewer." Before I could even formulate a response, a young black woman in a crisp catering uniform accidentally bumped a heavy tray of champagne flutes against the edge of the marble island. The glasses chimed loudly but did not break. Camille spun around, her eyes flashing with unwarranted vicious fury. "Excuse me," Camille yelled, stepping directly into the young woman's personal space. "Are you entirely incompetent? Those are imported crystal. If you shatter a single glass, I am taking it directly out of your pathetic hourly wages. You people simply do not know how to operate in a high-class environment." The young woman looked down, apologizing softly, her shoulders tense with the familiar humiliation of dealing with entitled, wealthy clients. I felt my jaw lock tight. My own daughter, a black woman who had grown up with every advantage my sweat could buy, was actively degrading a hard-working young woman of her own race just to assert her fake dominance. Kendall strolled into the kitchen, adjusting the cuffs of a newly purchased bespoke silk suit undoubtedly paid for with the stolen pawn shop cash. He chuckled cruelly at the scene. "Just fire her, Camille. We are about to be worth $50 million. We do not have to tolerate subpar labor. We can afford to hire the best." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, locking eyes with my son. "She is just doing her job, Camille," I said, my voice quiet but carrying a razor-sharp edge. "There is absolutely no need to speak to her like she is beneath you. Honest work deserves respect." Wyatt walked in from the foyer, catching the tail end of my sentence. He let out a loud, barking laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "Honest work, Ellis. Is that what you call unclogging toilets and patching drywall for minimum wage? We are operating on an entirely different level now. We are the job creators. We command the respect. You are just upset because you do not understand how real wealth operates." He stepped closer to me, aggressively invading my physical space. "Now grab your cheap fishing gear and get out of my house. Your depressing presence here is dragging down the entire property value." I looked at Wyatt's smug, punchable face, then at my daughter and son who were standing behind him with proud, arrogant smirks. I remembered the sweltering summers in the late 80s when Nadine and I were laying the very literal foundations of our commercial construction company. We faced ruthless systemic racism from white bankers who point-blank refused to loan us capital. We worked side by side, pouring concrete and framing heavy walls until our hands bled, bootstrapping every single project. We built our massive fortune by respecting every single laborer, every plumber, and every electrician who stepped onto our job sites. We knew that true wealth was built on uncompromising integrity and mutual respect. Now these four parasites were standing in the beautiful kitchen I bought, wearing clothes they stole from my personal safe, insulting the working class, and loudly claiming they were the masters of the universe. They were completely hollow. They possessed no actual skills, no real capital, and absolutely no honor. They had forged my signature on federal documents, stolen my late wife's precious jewelry, and planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward just to maintain this pathetic temporary illusion. I did not argue. I did not defend my dignity or the dignity of the young catering woman. Arguments are for people who still want to salvage a relationship. I was simply observing the final fleeting moments of their freedom. "You are absolutely right, Wyatt," I said smoothly, setting my water bottle down on the counter. "I am just a simple man. I will leave you to your massive success." I walked down the hallway to my bedroom and grabbed a small, worn duffel bag containing a change of clothes and the last of my encrypted hard drives. I walked back through the grand foyer, not looking back at the four criminals toasting their impending victory. I stepped out into the humid evening air, climbed into my heavy Ford F-150, and fired up the loud engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I watched the massive rental tents glowing brilliantly in my rearview mirror. They were actively preparing for the party of the century, a glamorous corporate coronation for Wyatt's tech empire and Camille's desperate social climbing dreams. They fully expected a team of anonymous, wealthy, white venture capitalists to arrive at the Grand Plaza Hotel tomorrow night and hand them a $5 million check. They expected to ascend to the absolute peak of high society, leaving me to rot in an affordable care facility. I drove my truck toward the cheap motel I had booked on the outskirts of town, a quiet, cold smile spreading across my face. Saturday night was only 24 hours away. The luxurious Grand Plaza Hotel was already being silently secured by undercover federal agents. And the elite anonymous CEO of the Apex Trust was currently driving a dirty, oil-stained pickup truck straight into the storm. Saturday night descended upon the city with a suffocating, electric anticipation. The Grand Plaza Hotel, a towering monument of glass and marble in the heart of the financial district, was bathed in warm golden light. A steady stream of luxury vehicles pulled up to the sweeping semicircular driveway where white-gloved valets scrambled to open the doors of sleek Mercedes sedans and pristine Bentleys. Inside the opulent grand ballroom, the fake coronation was in full swing. Wyatt had spared absolutely no expense utilizing the massive credit lines he falsely believed he had secured to create an illusion of untouchable corporate success. Crystal chandeliers cast a glittering glow over the local politicians, wealthy socialites, and tech industry executives who had gathered to witness his fabricated triumph. Waiters in crisp black tuxedos circulated effortlessly through the room, balancing silver trays loaded with imported caviar and vintage champagne. From my vantage point, parked a block away in the shadows, I watched the parade of wealth and privilege flow through the revolving glass doors. They were the city's elite, the gatekeepers of capital, all completely unaware that they had been formally invited to a federal crime scene. I checked the heavy steel watch on my wrist. It was exactly 7:45. Inside the ballroom, Wyatt was standing near the center of the room, holding court like a king. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see him wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, a crystal glass in one hand, casually bragging to a circle of older, wealthy white men about his revolutionary software platform. Camille stood right beside him, in a breathtaking emerald gown, her neck dripping with diamonds she had likely purchased using Kendall's stolen pawn shop cash. Chelsea and Kendall were mingling near the open bar, desperately trying to network their way into the upper echelon of the city's elite. They were basking in the intoxicating glow of stolen prestige, waiting for the anonymous executives from the Apex Trust to arrive and hand them a $5 million check. It was the perfect fragile bubble of absolute arrogance. It was time to pop it. I put my heavy Ford F-150 into gear. The massive diesel engine roared with a fierce guttural growl that echoed violently off the polished skyscrapers. I did not pull into the back alley. I did not look for street parking. I drove the battered, oil-stained truck directly up the immaculate semicircular driveway of the Grand Plaza Hotel, aggressively cutting off a brand-new silver Maserati. The head valet froze, his jaw dropping in pure horror as my rusted front bumper stopped inches from the red carpet. I killed the engine and stepped out into the humid night air. I was not wearing a tuxedo. I was wearing my faded, grease-stained canvas coveralls and heavy steel-toed work boots. My hands were visibly calloused and my baseball cap was pulled low over my eyes. The smell of motor oil and hot exhaust cut sharply through the heavy scent of expensive designer perfumes. The murmurs began instantly. The wealthy guests lingering near the glass windows stopped talking, their champagne flutes hovering near their mouths as they stared at the working-class black man desecrating their exclusive sanctuary. Through the massive glass panes, Camille spotted me. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost trapped in an emerald dress. She grabbed Wyatt's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging violently into his tuxedo jacket. Wyatt turned, his arrogant smile instantly twisting into a mask of absolute unadulterated panic. Chelsea let out an audible gasp, covering her mouth as if she had just witnessed a murder. The sheer naked terror radiating from the four of them was deeply satisfying. I did not hesitate. I walked slowly and deliberately up the pristine marble steps, the heavy thud of my work boots echoing like a ticking clock over the soft jazz music spilling from the lobby. As I approached the towering glass doors, the heavy judgmental stares of the elite crowd washed over me. I had felt those exact same stares decades ago. I remembered standing in the lobbies of banks that looked just like this one, holding meticulously prepared construction blueprints only to be dismissed by smug loan officers who refused to fund a black contractor. Nadine and I had endured their sneers, their polite rejections, and their systemic barriers. We fought tooth and nail bleeding for every single dollar until we possessed enough capital to buy the very buildings those bankers operated out of. Now my own children were eagerly seeking the validation of those same gatekeepers, completely willing to erase their own father to fit into a world of empty white-collar privilege. They were ashamed of the very hands that had built their effortless lives. A young black valet rushed up to me looking incredibly nervous, his eyes darting toward the hotel management who were already rushing across the lobby. "Sir, you cannot park that here," the young man whispered urgently. "You have to move it to the service entrance before they call the police." I looked at the young man, offering him a warm, reassuring smile. I handed him a crisp $100 bill along with my truck keys. "Leave it right there, son," I said softly. "It is exactly where it belongs tonight." I reached up and discreetly tapped the small wireless earpiece hidden beneath the brim of my cap. The crisp professional voice of Mr. Bradley crackled into my ear. "The perimeter is fully secured, Mr. Freeman. Special Agent Carter has his undercover team positioned at all 4 exits. The ballroom is completely locked down. Proceed when ready." Before I could even reach for the brass handle of the main entrance, the heavy doors violently burst open. Wyatt charged out onto the red carpet, his face flushed a dark, furious purple. His pristine tuxedo jacket was flaring open as he practically sprinted toward me. "What in the hell are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a venomous, barely contained rage. He grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging aggressively into my canvas coveralls. "I told you to stay away. The CEO of the Apex Trust is arriving in less than 10 minutes. You are going to ruin my entire life. Get back in that disgusting piece of trash and leave immediately before I have you arrested for trespassing." Camille and Chelsea were right behind him, their faces contorted in sheer panic and extreme humiliation. "Security!" Camille shrieked, waving frantically at the 2 massive uniformed hotel guards rushing out of the lobby. "Remove this man immediately. He does not belong here. He is harassing our guests." The 2 large security guards quickly closed the distance, their hands reaching out aggressively to grab my arms and physically drag me down the marble steps. The wealthy guests pressed against the glass, eagerly watching the poor, dirty handyman get violently ejected from their elite paradise. I did not step back. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I simply stared dead into Wyatt's terrified, greedy eyes, waiting for the final curtain to drop. The heavy hands of the hotel security guards clamped down hard on my shoulders. I planted my steel-toed boots firmly onto the polished marble of the Grand Plaza entrance. I did not struggle, but I did not yield a single inch. I had hauled hundreds of pounds of concrete and steel for decades. 2 men in cheap suits were not going to move me unless I allowed it. Wyatt was practically hyperventilating, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and raw panic. He leaned in so close that only I could hear the venom dripping from his teeth. "I will destroy you for this!" "Ellis, Wyatt," hissed, his voice shaking with a violent, barely contained rage. "If you cost me this $5 million deal, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a state-run psychiatric ward. I will take your house, your dignity, and everything you have ever cared about. I will wipe your name from this earth." I looked at the beads of sweat forming on his forehead, completely unfazed by his pathetic threats. "You are in no position to take anything from anyone, Wyatt," I replied in a low, even tone. "You are currently standing in a rented tuxedo hosting a party with stolen money, waiting for a savior who is never going to rescue you." Camille pushed past her husband, her emerald gown shimmering under the bright entrance lights. Her eyes were completely devoid of the little girl I had raised. She looked at me with a level of disgust usually reserved for vermin. "How could you be so incredibly selfish?" She snarled, her manicured hands balled into tight fists. "We are finally stepping into the upper echelon of society. We are finally breaking free from that mediocre working-class existence you forced us to endure. And you show up here smelling like a mechanic just to humiliate us. You are pathetic. You are nothing but an anchor trying to drag us down to your level. Security, get him out of my sight right now." Chelsea strutted out of the revolving glass doors, adjusting the diamond necklace around her throat. She did not even bother to lower her voice, clearly wanting the elite crowd pressed against the lobby glass to hear her fabricated narrative. "Please forgive this disruption, everyone," Chelsea announced loudly, waving a dismissive hand toward me. "This is just a confused, disgruntled handyman who used to do some minor plumbing work for our estate. He clearly forgot to take his medication and wandered to the wrong address. The authorities will handle him shortly." Kendall stepped out right behind his wife, looking impeccably sharp in the bespoke suit he had purchased with the cash from my stolen vintage Rolex. He did not look like my son. He looked like a cheap, hollow imitation of a wealthy man. He grabbed my arm, trying to yank me toward the truck, but my grip on my own stance was unbreakable. "Dad, stop embarrassing yourself and get back in that garbage truck," Kendall muttered through gritted teeth, aggressively refusing to make eye contact with me. "You do not belong here. You never belonged in a place like this. Go back to your dirty tools and let us handle the real money." I stared at Kendall, my own flesh and blood. The watch on his wrist was an expensive imitation, a fake luxury item bought with the sacrifice of his own mother. He was entirely willing to publicly disown me, to label me a confused laborer in front of a crowd of wealthy strangers just to maintain the fragile illusion of his fake prosperity. I felt the final definitive snap of the paternal bond. There was no going back from this moment. "You are absolutely right, Kendall," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the commotion. "I do not belong in a world built entirely on fraud, theft, and desperate lies. I build things that actually last. You just steal things that do not belong to you." Wyatt's face turned an alarming shade of purple. He signaled frantically to the hotel manager, who was rushing down the marble steps with a walkie-talkie pressed tightly to his ear. "Call the police immediately," Wyatt demanded, his voice booming across the elegant entryway. "I want this man arrested for trespassing, harassment, and public intoxication. Have his disgusting vehicle towed to the city impound. We have a billionaire CEO arriving at any second, and I will not allow this trash to ruin a $50 million valuation." The wealthy guests inside the lobby were whispering to each other, pointing at my grease-stained coveralls and shaking their heads in collective disapproval. They saw exactly what Wyatt wanted them to see. A poor, uneducated black man causing a violent scene at a high society event. They had no idea they were witnessing the greatest financial ambush of the decade. I looked directly at the hotel manager, who was reaching for his radio to call the local precinct. "I would highly advise against making that call, son," I warned him calmly. "You are going to want to see exactly how this plays out." Wyatt let out a loud, mocking laugh, throwing his hands up in the air. "Do you hear this guy?" Wyatt yelled, turning to the affluent crowd to gather their sympathy and validate his superiority. "He thinks he is in charge. He thinks he actually matters. You are nothing, Ellis. You are a relic of the past. You will die in that empty house with nothing to your name while we ascend to the absolute peak of the financial world. Now get your hands off my property and get out of my face." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I simply raised my right hand and gently tapped the hidden earpiece beneath the brim of my cap. "It is time," I whispered softly. The security guards tightened their grip on my arms, preparing to physically throw me down the marble steps. Wyatt turned his back on me, straightening his tuxedo jacket and plastering a fake charming smile back onto his face to greet his terrified guests. But before the guards could move me a single inch, the deafening screech of heavy tires echoed fiercely through the financial district. A massive, impenetrable convoy of sleek, black-armored SUVs and a custom bulletproof limousine aggressively rounded the corner. They did not pull up to the valet stand. They drove straight up the restricted VIP driveway, their headlights blinding the crowd, aggressively boxing in my old Ford F-150 and completely trapping Wyatt, Camille, Chelsea, and Kendall on the red carpet. The heavy, imposing grills of the black armored SUVs aggressively blocked the entire semicircular driveway, trapping my rusted Ford F-150 and the panicked group on the red carpet. The blinding glare of their halogen headlights sliced through the humid night air, casting long, sharp shadows across the pristine marble steps of the Grand Plaza Hotel. For a brief, suspended second, nobody moved. The two hotel security guards who had their hands clamped firmly down on my shoulders suddenly froze. They were standard hospitality employees trained to handle unruly patrons and minor disputes. They were entirely unprepared for the terrifying synchronized display of actual corporate power that was currently unfolding in front of them. The heavy reinforced doors of the lead and trailing SUVs opened in perfect unison. 8 massive, broad-shouldered men dressed in immaculate charcoal suits stepped out onto the pavement. They did not wear the cheap, flashy badges of local bouncers. They wore discreet communication earpieces and moved with a cold, military precision that instantly commanded absolute compliance. They swiftly formed a tactical perimeter around the bulletproof limousine, their eyes scanning the crowd of wealthy onlookers pressed against the lobby glass. 2 of the imposing operatives marched directly up the marble steps toward me. The hotel security guards immediately recognized the severe shift in the hierarchy of power. They did not utter a single word of protest. They simply released my arms and took 3 rapid steps backward, completely surrendering their physical authority. I stood my ground in my grease-stained canvas coveralls, adjusting the brim of my worn baseball cap, and watched the profound confusion wash over the faces of my family. Wyatt was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his rented tuxedo jacket. His eyes darted wildly from the armed security detail to the gleaming, elongated limousine. Because his entire existence was built on an unstable foundation of sheer arrogance and desperate delusion. His mind instantly misinterpreted the massive show of force. He genuinely believed that his salvation had just arrived. He thought the billionaire executives from the Apex Trust had deployed their elite private security to escort him into the high society event. The terror on Wyatt's face melted away rapidly, replaced by a sickening, triumphant smirk. He quickly smoothed the lapels of his jacket, ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, and puffed out his chest. He turned to Camille, offering her a reassuring, arrogant wink. Camille instantly straightened her posture, adjusting her emerald gown and lifting her chin to project the haughty demeanor of a wealthy tech founder's wife. Chelsea and Kendall mirrored their movements, quickly composing themselves, desperately eager to play their fabricated roles for the anonymous billionaires they believed were about to hand them a $5 million check. Wyatt stepped forward, completely ignoring me, and positioned himself at the very edge of the red carpet. He was ready to greet his saviors and apologize for the unsightly, dirty handyman who had briefly disrupted his glorious coronation. The rear passenger door of the bulletproof limousine slowly swung open. A heavy, leather-clad dress shoe stepped out onto the pavement. Mr. Bradley emerged from the luxurious interior of the vehicle. He looked absolutely immaculate. He wore a custom-tailored navy blue Tom Ford suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie perfectly knotted at his collar. He carried a thick leather-bound portfolio under his left arm, the exact portfolio containing the ironclad federal trap contract that Wyatt had eagerly agreed to sign. Mr. Bradley adjusted his cuffs, his sharp, analytical eyes sweeping over the grand entrance of the hotel. He exuded an aura of immense, untouchable wealth and undeniable legal authority. He was the absolute embodiment of the elite corporate world that Wyatt so desperately wanted to infiltrate. Wyatt's eyes lit up with sheer, unadulterated greed. He stepped off the marble steps and walked briskly toward the limousine, extending his right hand in a grand, welcoming gesture. "Welcome to the Grand Plaza Hotel," Wyatt projected loudly, ensuring his voice carried over the ambient noise of the idling engines so the wealthy guests inside the lobby could hear him. "I am Wyatt, the founder and CEO. We are incredibly honored to host the Apex Trust tonight. Please accept my deepest apologies for the minor disturbance at the entrance. We are currently having that confused trespasser removed from the premises so we can proceed with the signing." I watched my son-in-law offer his hand, his entire future banking on this single fabricated interaction. Mr. Bradley did not slow his pace. He did not extend his hand in return. He did not even look at Wyatt. Mr. Bradley walked right past the desperate, fraudulent tech CEO as if he were completely invisible. He treated Wyatt exactly the way Wyatt had treated me for the past 5 years, like an irrelevant, invisible speck of dirt on the pavement. Wyatt's outstretched hand hung pathetically in the empty air. His triumphant smile shattered instantly, replaced by a look of profound, agonizing confusion. Camille let out a small, sharp gasp, stepping back as the private security operatives seamlessly formed a protective barrier between the lawyer and her husband. Kendall and Chelsea stared in absolute shock, their social climbing dreams colliding violently with a reality they could not yet comprehend. Mr. Bradley marched directly up the marble steps, walking straight toward me. The wealthy onlookers, pressing their faces against the heavy glass doors of the lobby, watched in breathless fascination. They expected the high-powered executive to order his security team to violently throw the dirty working-class black man off the property. Instead, Mr. Bradley stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He offered a crisp, formal nod of profound respect, acknowledging my absolute authority without speaking a single word. The silence that fell over the entrance of the Grand Plaza Hotel was heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of absolute, terrifying quiet that precedes a catastrophic explosion. You could hear the distant wail of a city siren and the quiet hum of the armored engines, but no one on the red carpet dared to take a breath. The sheer, undeniable tension was wrapping around Wyatt's throat like a physical vice. He stared at Mr. Bradley, then at me, his mind frantically trying to process the impossible visual of a top-tier corporate lawyer showing deference to an oil-stained handyman. Mr. Bradley turned his back to Wyatt and faced the grand entrance of the hotel. To the left of the heavy revolving doors stood a sleek, modern podium setup intended for the valet manager to announce arriving VIP guests. One of the private security operatives stepped forward swiftly, unplugged the valet microphone from its stand, and handed it directly to the lawyer. Mr. Bradley gripped the microphone firmly in his right hand. He tapped the heavy steel mesh once. A sharp, resonant thump echoed through the outdoor speakers and reverberated across the immaculate marble courtyard. The sound sliced through the humid night air, instantly silencing any remaining whispers from the affluent crowd gathered behind the lobby glass. The stage was perfectly set. The trap was entirely secured. The elite society that Wyatt, Camille, Chelsea, and Kendall had lied, stolen, and forged federal documents to impress was now a captive audience. They were all waiting for the anonymous representative of the multi-billion-dollar Apex Trust to speak. The crisp, sharp thump of Mr. Bradley tapping the valet microphone echoed ominously across the immaculate marble courtyard. The sound sliced through the heavy, humid night air, carrying perfectly through the outdoor speakers and penetrating the thick glass doors of the Grand Plaza Hotel. Inside the opulent grand lobby, the bustling high society event came to an abrupt, jarring halt. The wealthy tech executives, the local politicians, and the elite socialites pressed against the glass immediately ceased their conversations. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes vanished. The soft ambient jazz music spilling from the interior speakers suddenly felt entirely out of place. Everyone was completely captivated by the intense, bizarre standoff unfolding on the red carpet. Wyatt stood frozen in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his outstretched right hand still hanging awkwardly in the empty space between him and the powerful corporate lawyer. He slowly lowered his arm, his chest heaving with erratic, panicked breaths. His delusional mind was desperately trying to comprehend why the senior managing partner of a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund was ignoring him entirely and holding a microphone instead of a $5 million contract. Mr. Bradley stood tall, his posture projecting absolute, undeniable authority. He brought the microphone close to his mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lawyer announced, his voice smooth, commanding, and carrying the immense weight of boundless capital. "Thank you all for attending this evening's presentation. As the senior managing partner representing the Apex Trust, I am here to formally introduce the founder, the sole visionary, and the exclusive chairman of our private equity fund." For a fraction of a second, Wyatt instinctively puffed out his chest. Even in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence, his arrogant, narcissistic brain clung to the impossible, pathetic hope that Mr. Bradley was about to introduce him as a new corporate partner. He practically vibrated with desperate anticipation. But Mr. Bradley did not look at Wyatt. He did not gesture toward the sweating, fraudulent startup founder. Instead, the immaculate corporate lawyer turned his body completely toward me. Mr. Bradley extended his free hand, his palm open and deeply respectful, directing the attention of every single wealthy guest, every armed security operative, and every terrified family member straight to the old black man standing in the grease-stained coveralls. "Please direct your absolute respect and your undivided attention." Mr. Bradley continued, his voice booming like thunder across the grand entrance, to my boss, the sole investor of the proposed $5 million capital injection, Mr. Ellis Freeman. Mr. Bradley then bowed his head slightly, a profound, undeniable gesture of complete corporate submission. The revelation hit the red carpet like a catastrophic seismic shockwave. The words Ellis Freeman hung in the heavy night air, completely and violently shattering the fabricated reality of my 4 children. Wyatt's knees visibly buckled beneath him. All the color drained instantly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky white. He looked at me, his eyes wide, his pupils dilated in sheer, unadulterated terror. The man he had repeatedly ordered to hide the man he called a pathetic blue-collar relic. The man whose signature he had just forged on federal mortgage documents that very morning was the very billionaire he had been begging for salvation. Wyatt opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless wheeze escaped his throat. He stumbled backward, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the red carpet. Camille let out a strangled, agonizing gasp. She staggered away from her husband, her expensive emerald gown catching awkwardly on the heel of her designer shoe. She clutched her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid. She looked at her father not as a discarded invisible handyman, but as the ultimate executioner of her entire social climbing existence. The horrifying realization that she had just publicly degraded and attempted to evict the sole master of the fortune she craved crashed down upon her. Kendall stared at me, his jaw dropping open. He looked physically ill. The devastating truth hit him with the force of a freight train. He had brazenly stolen a priceless engraved solid gold Rolex from my personal safe and sold it for pennies to a downtown pawn shop just to buy a tailored suit to impress the very man he stole it from. His arrogant posture collapsed instantly, his shoulders slumping as the suffocating weight of his impending federal theft charges settled over him. Inside the grand lobby, the wealthy investors and local politicians immediately grasped the severe gravity of the situation. They were ruthless, calculating individuals who understood the brutal dynamics of capital and power instinctively. They saw the undercover federal tactical operatives securing the perimeter exits. They saw the multi-billion-dollar corporate lawyer bowing deeply to the man in the dirty work boots. And they looked at Wyatt, the sweat pouring profusely down his face, realizing he was nothing but a hollow, fraudulent imposter. The affluent crowd began to physically step back from the glass doors. They moved with a synchronized, urgent revulsion, distancing themselves from the toxic tech founder as if he were infected with a highly contagious, lethal disease. Nobody wanted to be photographed or associated with a man who had just provoked the wrath of an invisible billionaire. Wyatt was now completely isolated on the red carpet. He was hyperventilating, his hands shaking violently at his sides, his eyes darting frantically, looking for an escape route that did not exist. Chelsea, standing near the revolving doors, lost her grip on reality entirely. The delicate crystal champagne flute she had been gripping slipped from her trembling, manicured fingers. It hit the polished marble steps with a sharp, explosive shatter. The sound of the breaking glass rang out clearly in the dead silent courtyard. Shards of expensive crystal and vintage champagne splashed across her designer heels, but she did not even look down. She just stared at me in absolute horrified disbelief. The fake empire they had all tried to build on my back had completely collapsed into dust and broken glass right in front of their eyes. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I maintained the cold, calculating stillness that I had learned from decades of dominating ruthless commercial boardrooms. I stepped forward, my heavy, steel-toed boots crunching deliberately over the shattered crystal of Chelsea's broken champagne glass. I walked right past Wyatt, who was trembling so violently he looked like he might genuinely faint on the red carpet. I stepped directly up to the valet podium. Mr. Bradley smoothly handed me the microphone, stepping back to stand shoulder to shoulder with the armed, silent security operatives. I reached up with my grease-stained fingers and slowly adjusted the brim of my faded baseball cap. I looked through the massive glass doors at the elite crowd who had just sneered at me moments ago, and then I turned my gaze directly onto Wyatt. The microphone crackled slightly as I brought it to my mouth. "You were absolutely right this morning, Wyatt," I said, my voice deep, calm, and echoing ruthlessly across the Grand Plaza entrance. "My old truck is an absolute embarrassment. It is dirty, it is loud, and it does not belong at a prestigious corporate event." I paused, letting the heavy, terrifying silence stretch out for a suffocating moment, locking eyes with my terrified son-in-law. "But what you have done," I continued, my tone turning to pure, unforgiving ice, "is far, far worse." My voice reverberated off the massive stone pillars and cut straight through the manicured crowd gathered inside the glass lobby. I did not break eye contact with Wyatt for a single second. "As the sole chairman and primary decision-maker of the Apex Trust, I am standing here tonight to make a formal public announcement regarding the highly anticipated venture capital injection." I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence amplify his absolute dread. Every wealthy investor pressing their face against the glass held their breath. The $5 million investment offer extended to this fabricated technology startup is hereby permanently revoked. The collective gasp from the affluent onlookers was loud enough to penetrate the thick revolving doors. Wyatt physically swayed his knees, buckling so severely he had to grab the edge of the brass valet stand just to keep from collapsing onto the concrete pavement. The imaginary empire he had built in his mind over the last 48 hours was instantly vaporized. Camille buried her face in her hands, letting out a sharp, pathetic sob as the reality of their massive financial ruin finally set in. They were completely bankrupt, and everyone in their precious high society circle now knew it. I handed the microphone back to the terrified valet and turned toward Mr. Bradley. The impeccably dressed lawyer stepped forward, unzipping the heavy leather portfolio he had been carrying tightly under his arm. He retrieved a thick stack of legal documents, their edges crisp and undeniably official. I took the papers from his hands and walked directly up to Wyatt, dropping the heavy stack squarely onto the valet podium with a loud, authoritative slap. "These are not just investment cancellation forms, Wyatt," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that only he, my daughter, and the immediate security detail could hear. "This top document is a direct verified copy of the $2 million commercial mortgage application you initiated 3 days ago. The exact application where you deliberately and fraudulently forged my signature to leverage my personal estate." Wyatt stared down at the printed pages, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a suffocating fish. His eyes darted toward Mr. Bradley, begging silently for some sort of legal loophole, but he found nothing but cold corporate hostility. "You thought you were a financial genius?" I continued, relentlessly ensuring every word acted as a hammer blow to his fragile ego. "You thought you could bypass the federal banking system by stealing an old man's social security card from a floor safe. But you did not outsmart anyone. I instructed my legal team to let that specific loan process. I watched you happily sign your own name to a massive federal wire fraud scheme. You did not secure funding for your fake company. You secured a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary." Camille stepped forward, her emerald dress rustling aggressively against the pavement. She reached out with a trembling hand, her eyes filled with desperate, manipulative tears that had worked on me so many times when she was a child. "Dad, please," she begged, her voice cracking under the sheer weight of her impending destruction. "He made a mistake. We were just so incredibly desperate for the business to succeed. We can cancel the loan tomorrow morning. We can give the house back to you. You cannot do this to your own family. We are your blood." I looked at my daughter, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, hollow disappointment. "You forfeited the right to call yourselves my family the moment you sat around my dining table and plotted to lock me in a psychiatric ward," I replied, my tone turning to pure, unforgiving ice. Mr. Bradley reached into his pocket and handed me a small, encrypted digital recorder. I pressed a single button, holding the device up for them to see. The crisp, clear audio of Wyatt's voice filled the tight space between us. "The old man is clearly losing his mind. We will get a psychiatric certificate. Once we have medical power of attorney, he will lose all control of the estate." The recording clicked off, leaving a ringing silence. Camille staggered backward as if she had been physically struck by a heavy blow. She knew I had heard every single vile word. The brutal, undeniable truth of their malicious medical conspiracy was out in the open, completely obliterating any pathetic excuse she could possibly fabricate to save herself. I turned my back on Wyatt and Camille, shifting my unwavering, furious focus directly to Kendall and Chelsea. They were huddled together near the edge of the red carpet, looking exactly like terrified rats caught in a blinding spotlight. Kendall was sweating profusely, the moisture seeping through the collar of his brand-new bespoke suit. I reached into the front pocket of my canvas coveralls and pulled out a crumpled white envelope. I walked over and tossed it directly at his chest with a flick of my wrist. The envelope hit his lapel and a small printed receipt fluttered out, landing face up on the pristine marble steps. "That is the exact transaction log from the downtown pawn shop," I stated coldly, watching his eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated horror. "You broke into my personal safe to steal the solid gold Rolex your mother bought me for our 20th wedding anniversary. You took a priceless family heirloom and sold it to a stranger for $8,000 just so you could buy a cheap suit and your wife could buy a designer dress for a corporate party that was never going to happen." Chelsea let out a high-pitched, hysterical whine, desperately looking around to see if the wealthy guests inside were close enough to hear the brutal accusation of common theft. Kendall could not even meet my gaze. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado and unearned pride. "You both absolutely disgust me," I continued, my voice echoing with absolute crushing finality. "You stole the very memory of your hard-working mother to fund a pathetic, shallow illusion of wealth." The crushing reality of the situation finally broke Wyatt's paralyzed state. The overwhelming weight of the massive federal crimes, the utter public humiliation in front of the city elite, and the absolute undeniable destruction of his fake empire triggered his cowardly fight-or-flight response. He looked past me, his wild, bloodshot eyes locking onto the dark, empty alleyway adjacent to the sprawling hotel courtyard. He took a sudden, desperate step backward, clearly intending to abandon his wife, his family, and his mounting legal responsibilities to flee into the night like a common street thief. Wyatt turned his entire body, his expensive rented tuxedo shoes pivoting sharply on the smooth marble, ready to sprint toward the covering shadows of the financial district. He did not care about salvaging his dignity or his marriage. He just wanted to escape the invisible federal trap closing tightly around his neck. But he never even made it past the brass valet podium. Before his front foot could strike the pavement for a second step, the heavy reinforced double doors of the hotel lobby were violently kicked open from the inside. The heavy brass handles smashed loudly against the exterior glass panes, shattering the quiet tension of the courtyard with a violent crash. A booming, unyielding voice ripped through the humid night air, echoing with absolute legal authority, freezing Wyatt instantly in his tracks. The heavy double doors of the Grand Plaza Hotel rebounded with a violent crash. Out from the glittering, affluent lobby stormed 6 imposing figures. They did not wear the crisp tuxedos of the tech elite or the standard uniforms of local patrolmen. They were clad in dark, tactical windbreakers, the bold yellow letters of the FBI glaring under the harsh exterior lights. Heavy gold and silver badges hung from chains around their necks, catching the reflection of the armored SUVs blocking the driveway. Special Agent Carter led the tactical formation, his face a mask of uncompromising federal authority. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision, instantly fanning out across the red carpet to sever every conceivable escape route. Wyatt remained completely paralyzed, his expensive rented dress shoes rooted to the polished marble. The flight response that had urged him to sprint into the dark alley completely evaporated, replaced by the crushing, suffocating reality of a multi-agency federal raid. The wealthy guests pressed against the lobby glass, gasped collectively, their champagne flutes trembling as the sheer magnitude of the law enforcement presence transformed the luxurious corporate event into an active, high-stakes crime scene. Wyatt Matthew Hayes, Special Agent Carter, announced, projecting absolute legal finality over the stunned crowd. "You are under arrest for 2 counts of federal wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft." Carter did not wait for a response or a pathetic explanation. 2 massive federal agents lunged forward, grabbing Wyatt by the shoulders of his rented tuxedo. They spun him around violently, slamming his chest hard against the brass valet podium. Wyatt let out a sharp, breathless grunt as his arms were wrenched behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists with a sharp, unforgiving click. He did not fight back. He simply wept, his tears dripping onto the polished brass as his fake empire officially shattered into federal custody. "I am not a criminal," Wyatt sobbed, his voice cracking in total humiliation. "I was just trying to secure funding. I was going to pay it all back." Agent Carter ignored the pathetic confession, swiftly patting down the disgraced tech founder and extracting his wallet and smartphone as primary evidence. Simultaneously, 2 marked local police cruisers that had been quietly waiting down the block tore into the hotel entrance, their red and blue sirens painting the courtyard in frantic bursts of light. 4 uniformed city officers stepped out, marching directly toward Kendall and Chelsea. Chelsea let out a piercing, hysterical shriek as an officer firmly grabbed her arm. "What are you doing?" she screamed, thrashing wildly in her designer dress. "Get your hands off me. We are wealthy. We belong at this party." The commanding officer remained entirely unfazed by her delusional outburst. "Kendall Freeman and Chelsea Freeman," the officer stated loudly, ensuring the elite onlookers heard every single word. "You are both under arrest for grand larceny and the fencing of stolen luxury property." Kendall's knees buckled instantly. He did not resist. He simply hung his head in absolute shame as the cold steel cuffs locked around his wrists. He looked like a terrified child, completely stripped of the arrogant swagger he had displayed in my kitchen just hours earlier. Chelsea, however, continued to fight, kicking her expensive heels against the marble steps until a female officer forcefully pinned her against the side of a police cruiser to secure her restraints. The affluent investors and local politicians inside the lobby watched in sheer disgust, witnessing the absolute destruction of the fraudsters who had dared to invite them to a fake coronation. Camille stood entirely alone on the red carpet. Her husband was being shoved into the back of an armored federal vehicle, and her brother was weeping against the hood of a city police cruiser. The emerald gown that was supposed to mark her ascension into high society now looked like a cruel mocking costume. The suffocating reality of her profound financial and social ruin finally broke her. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail and threw herself forward. She collapsed onto the hard marble pavement right at my feet, her hands reaching out desperately to clutch the fabric of my grease-stained canvas coveralls. "Dad, please," Camille begged, her voice entirely stripped of its former entitlement, replaced by raw, primal terror. "Please make them stop. You have all the money. You own the Apex Trust. You can afford the best defense lawyers in the country. Fix this. I will do anything. We will move out of your house tonight. We will never ask you for another dime. Please, Dad, you have to save us." I looked down at the woman I had raised, feeling a chilling, profound emptiness where my paternal love used to reside. She was not crying because she regretted plotting to lock me in a psychiatric ward. She was crying because she had finally been caught. I slowly and deliberately took a step backward, physically pulling the hem of my coveralls out of her desperate, grasping hands. I looked her dead in the tear-filled eyes, my voice carrying the freezing weight of absolute finality. "I am just a simple handyman, Camille," I replied, my words echoing clearly across the silent courtyard. "How on earth could I possibly help you?" I did not wait for her response. I did not offer a single ounce of comfort or a shoulder to cry on. I simply turned my back on the wreckage of their fabricated lives. Mr. Bradley offered me one final, deeply respectful nod before turning to coordinate the asset seizures with Special Agent Carter. I walked slowly down the marble steps, the heavy tread of my steel-toed work boots ringing with absolute authority. The wealthy socialites and powerful tech executives pressed against the lobby glass stared at me, not with the disgust they had shown 30 minutes ago, but with profound, unadulterated awe. They parted instinctively as I walked past the massive glass panes, recognizing the terrifying, quiet power of a man who could orchestrate a federal takedown without raising his voice. I walked straight to my battered, oil-stained Ford F-150, unlocked the heavy steel door, and climbed into the driver's seat. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Camille was still sobbing on the red carpet, completely surrounded by the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers, watching her entire universe collapse into dust. 6 months had passed since the flashing red and blue sirens illuminated the pristine marble courtyard of the Grand Plaza Hotel, fracturing my family's illusion of wealth into a million irreparable pieces. I was now sitting in the back row of a sterile, wood-paneled federal courtroom in the heart of the city. The heavy oak doors were sealed tightly shut, and the overwhelming, inescapable weight of the United States justice system pressed down heavily on the defendants sitting at the front tables. Mr. Bradley sat composedly beside me, his leather briefcase resting neatly on his lap. We were merely silent spectators, now watching the inevitable conclusion of a disaster my children had entirely brought upon themselves. The federal judge, a stern woman with absolutely zero tolerance for white-collar crime and financial manipulation, adjusted her glasses and looked down from her elevated bench. The air in the room was completely stagnant, thick with the smell of floor wax and impending doom. Wyatt stood before her, entirely stripped of his bespoke tailored suits and his arrogant, unearned smirks. He was wearing a standard oversized orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists were heavily shackled to his waist, his shoulders slumped in absolute irreversible defeat. The grand illusion of his elite tech empire had been completely reduced to a thick stack of damning federal indictments resting on the judge's desk. The judge did not mince her words or offer a single shred of leniency. She methodically outlined the sheer audacity of the $2 million commercial mortgage fraud, the aggravated identity theft, and the brazen attempt to deceive a federally insured banking institution. "Wyatt Matthew Hayes," she announced, her voice echoing with cold, uncompromising finality, "you are sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole." Wyatt physically collapsed against the defense table, letting out a hollow, agonizing sob as the armed federal marshals immediately hauled him away. There would be no luxury chalets, no expensive green smoothies, and no high society galas in his foreseeable future. He was facing a decade and a half of bare concrete walls and heavy steel doors. Kendall and Chelsea were next on the docket, facing the local municipal judge in a separate hearing later that exact same afternoon for the brazen theft of Nadine's solid gold Rolex. They managed to avoid hard prison time by pleading guilty to grand larceny, but the judge showed them absolutely no mercy regarding their punishment. They were both handed 3 years of strict probation and ordered to complete 1,000 hours of grueling manual community service. The very next week, I drove my truck past the city highway and saw them wearing bright yellow reflective vests, sweating profusely under the unforgiving summer sun. The couple who had once turned up their noses at my honest labor were now actively picking up discarded fast food wrappers and filthy trash from the muddy roadside ditches. They were finally doing honest manual labor, though certainly not by choice. Camille was not criminally charged with any federal offenses, but her ultimate punishment was arguably a life sentence of profound, inescapable humiliation. Without my silent financial safety net, and with Wyatt's assets entirely seized by federal authorities to pay back his massive list of defrauded creditors, she was left completely destitute. The grand 6-bedroom estate they had occupied rent-free was officially put on the market. I liquidated the property for a massive cash sum, selling it to a lovely young doctor and his family, and permanently severed my last physical tie to my ungrateful offspring. Forced to survive entirely on her own, Camille was forced to move into a tiny rundown studio apartment in a remarkably rough neighborhood. She secured a minimum wage job working as a waitress at a greasy 24-hour diner on the industrial edge of town. She spent her long, exhausting shifts wiping down sticky laminated tables and serving cheap black coffee to weary truck drivers desperately trying to chip away at the mountain of secondary debt Wyatt had maliciously left in her name. She had finally descended to the harsh working-class reality she had so aggressively despised and mocked. With the toxic parasites permanently removed from my financial ecosystem, I focused my time and immense energy on cultivating actual meaningful growth. I directed Mr. Bradley to fundamentally restructure a significant portion of the Apex Trust. We established a massive comprehensive scholarship and venture capital fund specifically designed to support hardworking, innovative African-American youth who wanted to start their own legitimate businesses. Instead of funding lazy, entitled frauds who wanted to skip the struggle, my money was now actively breaking down the same systemic financial barriers that Nadine and I had fought so bitterly to overcome decades ago. I was building a true, enduring legacy, empowering brilliant young minds who implicitly understood the undeniable value of sweat equity, community uplift, and uncompromising integrity. As for my own life, I realized I did not need a sprawling mansion or a grand estate to prove my worth to anyone. I took a small fraction of the liquid cash from the sale of the 6-bedroom house and purchased a modest, beautifully crafted wooden cabin nestled deep in the lush green woods. It sat right on the edge of a crystal-clear, quiet lake, completely isolated from the frantic, greedy noise of the city. The air there smelled heavily of fresh pine needles and crisp, cool water, entirely free of toxic entitlement and suffocating arrogance. I spent my early mornings fishing in the rolling mist, my afternoons reading quietly on the wraparound wooden porch, and my evenings enjoying the profound, unbroken silence of nature. I was surrounded by a deep, resonant peace that money alone could not buy, a tranquility born entirely from cutting out the rot that had infected my life for far too long. After finalizing the last of the trust paperwork with Mr. Bradley, I walked out of the federal building and stepped into the bright, blinding afternoon sun. The city streets were bustling with businessmen in sharp suits rushing aggressively to their next meetings, entirely unaware of the quiet, absolute justice that had just been served within those walls. I walked right past the expensive, multi-level parking garages and headed straight for the designated municipal surface lot. Sitting there looking beautifully rugged, perfectly reliable, and entirely unbothered by the passage of time was my battered, oil-stained Ford F-150. I climbed up into the driver's seat, feeling the familiar, comfortable embrace of the worn vinyl against my back. I gripped the steering wheel firmly with both hands, running my calloused thumb over the smooth, worn leather. I slid the heavy metal key into the ignition and turned it with a firm, decisive flick of my wrist. The massive diesel engine roared to life instantly, a fierce mechanical growl that vibrated powerfully and steadily through the steel chassis. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. I shifted the heavy truck into gear and pulled out onto the open, winding highway, pointing the heavy chrome grille directly toward the distant horizon. The golden sun was beginning its slow, spectacular descent, casting brilliant fiery streaks of orange, pink, and deep purple across the vast sky. I pressed my heavy work boot down on the accelerator, leaving the towering city skyline, the pathetic lies, and the heavy burdens completely behind me in the dust. I was a 70-year-old man, entirely free, incredibly wealthy in every conceivable sense of the word, and driving confidently into the beautiful, quiet rest of my life. Sitting on the wrap-around porch of my wooden cabin, watching the morning mist roll gently off the surface of the lake, I finally had the time and the absolute silence required to process the magnitude of the last 6 months. The crisp, pine-scented air filled my lungs, replacing the suffocating toxicity that had poisoned my own home for years. With a hot cup of black coffee resting in my calloused hands, I looked out at the rippling water and realized the most profound, devastating lesson this entire ordeal had taught me. It was a lesson about the true nature of wealth, the dangerous illusion of unconditional generosity, and the catastrophic damage of unearned privilege. For decades, I had operated under a fundamentally flawed assumption. I believed that my primary duty as a father was to completely shield my children from the harsh, grueling struggles that their mother and I had endured. Nadine and I had faced systemic racism, predatory lending practices, and the bone-deep exhaustion of building a commercial construction empire from absolute scratch. We had spent our youth hauling concrete, fighting for every single inch of respect and stretching every dollar until it practically snapped. Because we loved Camille and Kendall with every fiber of our beings, we desperately wanted their lives to be easier. We wanted them to start on third base, never having to know the bitter taste of genuine financial terror. We paid their college tuitions in full, bought their first cars, and provided a massive 6-bedroom safety net so they could pursue their dreams without the crushing weight of survival hanging over their heads. But as I watched the sun slowly rise over the distant tree line illuminating the quiet woods, I understood the terrible consequence of our unconditional financial love. By removing the struggle, we had inadvertently removed the very friction required to build character. We did not give them a head start. We gave them a paralyzing handicap. They never learned the immense, humbling pride of earning a dollar through honest sweat. Because they never had to build anything of their own, they completely lacked the capacity to respect what others had built. They looked at our massive fortune and saw an ATM machine that they were inherently entitled to, rather than the physical manifestation of our lifetime of sacrifice. The hardest truth I had to swallow, a truth that still aches in the quiet moments of the night, is that my silent, enduring generosity was the very fertilizer that allowed their toxic arrogance to bloom. I set my coffee mug down on the wooden railing and picked up a thick stack of printed applications resting on the patio table. They were the first batch of candidates for the newly restructured Apex Trust Venture Capital Fund. I slowly turned the pages, reading the meticulous business plans and passionate personal essays of brilliant, hardworking young African-American men and women. They were requesting modest grants to start neighborhood bakeries, innovative software companies, and local contracting firms. Their words were heavily saturated with ambition, raw hunger, and a profound respect for the value of capital. Reading their stories, I saw the exact same fire that had burned in Nadine's eyes 40 years ago. These young entrepreneurs were not asking for a free ride or a luxury chalet in Aspen. They were asking for a single fighting chance to prove their worth. They understood that real power is not inherited or demanded. It is forged in the fires of adversity and cemented through uncompromising integrity. By redirecting my wealth away from my entitled, fraudulent offspring and toward these relentless, hungry innovators, I was finally doing what I should have done decades ago. I was investing in actual character. I learned that blood does not automatically grant someone a permanent, irrevocable lease on your soul, your dignity, or your bank account. True family is not defined by shared DNA or a common last name. It is entirely defined by mutual respect, shared values, and a love that does not evaporate the second the financial well runs dry. I had to endure the ultimate betrayal, the agonizing realization that my own children viewed me as a disposable, blue-collar nuisance, to finally break the chains of my own paternal guilt. Setting ironclad, unforgiving boundaries was not an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation, and ironically, the only real parenting I had done in years. I forced them to face the brutal, uncompromising reality of the world, a reality where fraudulent actions carry devastating federal consequences, and where respect must be earned, not demanded. As the morning sun fully illuminated the tranquil lake, casting a brilliant, blinding golden light across the rippling water, I leaned back in my wooden rocking chair. I felt a profound, unshakable peace settle deep into my bones. The heavy, agonizing burdens of my past were permanently severed, locked away in federal penitentiaries and run-down diners. I was a 70-year-old man who had successfully reclaimed his empire, his narrative, and his absolute freedom. I had learned the hardest lesson of all, but I had survived to tell the tale richer in spirit and wisdom than ever before. If my journey has reminded you of your own worth, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of surviving betrayal and reclaiming your absolute power.